everyone. My name is Juliet Jones. I'm one of the board members of the Friends of Warm Mineral Springs, and we want to welcome you here today. It seems like there's a lot of people who are concerned about the future of Warm Mineral Springs, and that's why we're here. We formally invited each and every one of the Sarasota County and City of Northport commissioners to attend, and we did have Rhonda DeFranco here in attendance. And we were so happy to see her too. I'd like to tell you that the mission of the Friends of Warm Mineral Springs is to restore, preserve, and protect the natural environment and the valuable natural resources and historical resources at the spring, and to educate the public and our leadership in support of this mission. And collateral to this presentation, we're going to be doing a presentation, a group, I should say, meeting, different presentations, once a month, every Tuesday, the second Tuesday of every week of every month, starting in April at 6:30 p.m. right here at the Venice Ramada Inn. So I want to take a moment now to introduce the other members of the board. Bill Delp, who is the president of the Friends of Warm Mineral Springs, Mike Ainge, over there in the green shirt, who's the vice president, and also our advocate and legal advisor, Ralph Brooks. Where is Ralph? Yay! Thank you. I'm going to introduce Ralph a little further. He's board certified in city, county, and local government law, and has a solo practice, and also serves as outside counsel and co-counsel on land use and environmental law all throughout Florida. Locally, he formerly served as an assistant to the Sarasota County Attorney. His credentials as an attorney and mediator are way too extensive to go into here. Gosh, all the stuff he's done. He's also an adjunct professor at Florida Gulf Coast University teaching environmental law. And previous to becoming an attorney, Ralph earned his Bachelor of Science degree in geology and marine science from the University of Miami. And he's one of the best people I know. And and everyone who knows him is impressed by his heartfelt devotion to this vital work. So Ralph is going to moderate our question and answer session today in a consensus program that we've developed, and that program is helped to represent how you feel and what you think about these issues. So Ralph, can you say a few words about that?
Warm Mineral Springs is a very special place. Every time I swim in Warm Mineral Springs, I feel great for the rest of the day, for the rest of the next day, and for the rest of the next day, and then I want to go back and visit again. I think each of you have your own reasons why it's special. I know how I have my reasons. Today, at the end of the session, we want to do something new and innovative, something that I think most of the other processes and hearings they've had on Warm Mineral Springs have forgotten. It's not about what the speaker tells you, it's about what you think. It's about the group. It's a collaborative effort. Juliet had a dream. I love telling people this story with your permission. She had a dream, and in the dream, she saw Warm Mineral Springs. And on the banks of Warm Mineral Springs, she saw people. She saw thousands of people from different generations, different times, from hundreds of years ago to thousands of years ago. And they were all there in her dream at the spring. And she could clearly see who they were, see their personalities, and see what they were wearing, their dress, their ceremonies. All this is Warm Mineral Springs. So at the end of today, we're going to do a collaboration, and what we're going to do, instead of question and answer, we're going to do something my children are doing in school right now. It's a brainstorming technique where we're going to take audience things and put them on this whiteboard. And No idea is wrong. No idea is going to be shouted down. Every idea will go on the board. We're going to put Warm Mineral Springs in the circle in the middle of the board, and from around the board we're going to create what my children do. It's called a mind map. So if you say Warm Mineral Springs, what does it mean? What is it about? What's Warm Mineral Springs? And you want to say something, for example, archaeology, then I'll put archaeology around Warm Mineral Springs with an arrow or a line going to it. And then someone may say, well, this is further refinement in archaeology, and we'll put another line going to archaeology. There may be water quality, there may be water flow. We'll have different arrows going different places. And then we'll take a little break, and the green cards that are in front of you are for your ideas. So once we have everything on the board, and you may even want to start putting your ideas down now, because I know a lot of you have ideas and want to share them. So then after we get the mind map done, we're going to take everyone's ideas on things to do, or things to think about, or things that concern you, or action items, whatever it is you want. It doesn't have to be constrained, but put it on the green paper, and we'll see if we can match it up with what's on the mind map, and we're going to come forward out of the conference with something called conference statements. I don't necessarily know if there'll be consensus or not, but if there is, we'll call it conference consensus statements, and then we'll type them all up, and we'll have that available for you to use anytime you go to a public comment or a public hearing. You could say the Warm Mineral Springs Conference Consensus Statement said, and it may help give some gravitas to what you're saying. It's not just you, it's the group. It's the collaborative effort of all of us that really are Warm Mineral Springs. The future of Warm Mineral Springs is in our hands. And it's up to us what we do with Warm Mineral Springs. If you can imagine it, it can be done. And I think today you're going to see some wonderful things, hear from wonderful speakers, see some wonderful photographs, parts of which I have seen before that have moved me. Made me think intellectually, made me feel emotional, raised the hairs on my arms, and gave me goosebumps and brought a tear to my eye. So that's my thought and my hope for what you'll gain out of this experience, and what Warm Mineral Springs means to the group. So thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. So I'm going to start out with a couple of my thoughts. 10 years ago, I moved to this area, to Warm Mineral Springs, like so many others in our community, because of my attraction to the spring. I used the waters on a weekly basis. But in the last 3 years before the springs closed, the degradation of the water environment became increasingly evident to me. The little fish began to vanish. The birds who ate them diminished. Dead turtles were reported. The rare anaerobic algae and scent of sulfur disappeared. By the time the springs closed on June 30th, 2012, the waters had weakened noticeably. And just before the springs closed, I found out from studying the Sarasota County records that the operator had been allowed to pour algicide into the spring for over 30 months. A substance which was not tested or approved for use in salt or mineral waters. And this was unheard of in my knowledge of the springs. It's a natural healing spring, at least in modern history. The ecology of the water was really compromised. Now there's a slight smell of sulfur. The smell is strengthening, but it's very, very different from what it was 10 years ago. I know because I live right next to the springs. And I'm very aware of the strength of the scent of sulfur as I come and go. But from my very first contact with the springs, I was sensing that it was an eco-sacred place which should be protected, cared for, and honored according to its true nature. This is what was promised by the city and the county in the purchase of the springs. Protection, as John Moran once told me, means doing no harm, prevention from harm. But there is even greater challenges now than this on our plate. I look at Warm Mineral Springs as a microcosm for the challenges and opportunities facing the entire state of Florida today. One need not look further than the front page of the Sarasota Herald Tribune to realize that serious ecological challenges are upon us. Water pollution, dangers to the water supply, poor land use, overdevelopment, manatee deaths, disregard for springs and recharge areas, and Florida's threatened springs themselves. How ironic that these very same issues have been suppressed and ignored with respect to the stewardship of War Mineral Springs. A man approached me the other day to inform me that War Mineral Springs had been around for thousands of years and will be around for thousands more. Another former staff operator of the same company who used the algicide was quoted in the paper, whether it's flowing at 9 million or it's flowing at 3 million, what the heck is the difference? It's still a lot of water. It does seem like a lot of water, doesn't it? White Sulphur Spring, a sister mineral spring in northern Florida, once flowed at nearly 50 million gallons daily. In May 1998, it dropped to 2.7 million gallons daily. In 1999, it ceased to flow altogether for many years, returning in September 2013 for a few months just as a trickle. So it went from 50 million gallons to nothing. Not 3 million gallons, 50 million. The people in White Springs thought that their spring would last forever, but development and pollution over recharge areas virtually eliminated this spring. And like War Mineral Springs, it was once a popular tourist attraction. Dr. Helen Miller of White Springs has been gracious enough to come here today to tell us the story, so you can hear it from her directly. If we choose to acknowledge our challenges and work to establish and protect our recharge area, to restore and preserve War Mineral Springs, and to keep it as it should be, as a parkland free from development, it may in time become one of the greatest ecotourism attractions on the planet. In fact, it has been so when the waters were rich, done without social media, without hype, without high buck spin, without a glitzy hotel in the property, but solely due to the strength and water quality of its mineral waters and unique heritage, and open to everyone at a reasonable rate. The difficulties we face around issues of public use of our spring, its preservation, restoration, and protection are saddening and demoralizing for many people. War Mineral Springs has not been kept open to the public, as was one of the reasons given for originally the purpose and promise by leadership when it became publicly owned. But now there are even more serious promises being broken. War Mineral Springs was purchased as an environmentally sensitive parkland property. We do not believe the majority of people in Northport and Sarasota County want to see this property used to build a hotel and a subdivision of 270 homes, as described in Article 7 of the Northport City Plan for Land Use, which incidentally was created before this property was purchased for parkland. There are a few very visible economic development groups, small in membership but very loud in the paper, that do not want to see this property as a parkland. They want to see it developed to satisfy economic interests and developers' interests. We believe the majority of the community wants a park and publicly owned property, and irresponsible development is not in the ecological or community interest, and it was not the reason given to the public for the purchase of this 87 acres. Irresponsible development is at the expense of the welfare of the community at large and of the spring, and no development at all should take place without a full-scale United States Geological Survey. We don't mean a scaled-down, cheaper model that overlooks a lot of the important facts about the recharge area. We mean a full-scale USGS survey, as was originally turned over to the Sarasota County and Northport Commissions when they first approached the USGS. Of course, that was later. That whole issue was dropped. Also, many people are confused about the real reasons for the closure of the spring and have been misinformed by the slant of certain media. Some feel they'd like to do something, but they don't know what to do, and are frustrated by their sense of disempowerment. So our program here today is designed to help you become better educated and more aware about important ecological and water issues and community issues affecting Warm Mineral Springs and what you can do about these things. Again, the second Tuesday evening of every month, beginning in April at 6:30, we'll have a meeting which will concentrate on informing people and continuing education. So please consider attending. And we want to thank you for your donation today, which helps offset the cost of today's program. And if you'd like to join our efforts to reopen the springs and to restore, protect, and preserve, please consider becoming a member of the Friends of Warm Mineral Springs. You can use the same donation you used to get into the program today to apply and secure a membership. The urgent question now in closing is not what Warm Mineral Springs can do for you, but what you can do for Warm Mineral Springs. But whatever you do, I urge you not to feel disempowered or defeated. Remember the words of Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So, we've been so fortunate to gather here for you today some of the most thoughtful, committed individuals who have devoted their lives to the restoration and protection of Florida waters and springs and of our natural environment, pioneers of awareness and veterans of action. So, of course, more people have deep knowledge of springs preservation and restoration than we could fit into our program. So we have asked a group of folks to come as what we call table presenters. And they're kind of filling in the pieces because we just couldn't put any more people on the program. And I'm going to introduce them now, but before that, I'd like to thank the staff of the Venice Ramada Inn. Boy, they are great, very helpful. Thank you. And our volunteer staff, Marilyn, Shelley, Michelle, and Joan Heron San Luis also. Thank you so much. So briefly, I want to point out to you, we have with us today, as I mentioned, Dr. Helen Miller and her husband, Ed. Helen is the mayor of White Sulphur Springs, and she's going to come up here and briefly tell the story. She's got quite a story. And Ray Judah is here today. Ray, where are you today? Ray is best known as a former Lee County commissioner, but he does, I'm going to introduce him when he comes up here too. He's got a long and amazing bio. And I'd like to introduce John Scott and Ruth McGregor. Where are you guys? They're going to be manning one of the tables too. They're with the Clean Water Initiative of Florida, who are currently working with the Clean Water Declaration campaign to get clean water declarations signed by the people of Florida. Sierra Club, her Sarasota president of that chapter is here today, Chris Costello. Where are you, Chris? And you know the Sierra Club is one of the oldest and most largest and most influential environmental protection organizations to educate and protect the environment in the United States. And the Sarasota chapter is the headquarters of Slime Crimes Campaign and a statewide quality water program, which includes the Florida Clean Water Declaration campaign. So you'll want to see them and consider signing the declaration. And finally, the Save the Manatee group has sent along some literature. It's at the end table. You know, Warm Mineral Springs, one of the reasons it was purchased was to protect the downstream habitat of the manatee. So no clean water, no good water, no water means no manatee protection. And then one other table, last but not least, is the Colonel William Royal table. Mike Jackson is manning that table. He's got a lot of interesting facts and artifacts. And this month, you may know, is being celebrated as Florida Archaeology Month, and there's a beautiful poster of War Mineral Springs up at his table, donated to us by Steve Koski, who's the founder of the Friends of Little Salt Springs, and very active in the archaeology, War Mineral Springs Archaeology Group. And our way of celebrating Colonel William Royal's contribution as a diver, explorer, intuitive, and amateur archaeologist is now to strive to get a day named for him in the state of Florida. And so when you want to learn more about William Royal, you can go to Michael's table, but he found the first artifacts and a human skull in War Mineral Springs, which was radiocarbon dated to be over 10,000 years old. And that and other bone artifacts that were found are generally accepted to be the first evidence of human occupation at that time, to be that old. So now we'll get to the presenters and begin to acknowledge them and present them. The life of War Mineral Springs, of course, is ancient. It's a miracle that we've moved into the modern age and still have the possibility of direct contact with these ancient sacred waters. You know, the first time I visited War Mineral Springs, I saw a sign over the tunnel. It was in glittering, bold letters, and it spelled out the word miracles. Well, that sign was taken down about the same time the algicide started to be added to the waters, which is an interesting coincidence. Miracles often happen in humble places, in places where the power of the sacred speaks through nature and through individuals. So we ask you now to join us in holding a deep thought for miracles again to return to War Mineral Spring. And we've invited an appropriate person today to remind and support us in remembering this, and his name is Jim Gooden. Jim is a recognized Native American, registered with the Southern Cherokee of Oklahoma. He is known in Native circles as Arrowhawk, is recognized as a spiritual leader and healer. Several years ago, Jim founded his nonprofit 501c3 organization, the Red Road to Wellness Center, where he treats clients from drug and alcohol rehabilitation centers, offering them another 30 to 60 days to work on themselves. When Jim returned from the Vietnam War, he worked at the VA hospital in Columbia, Missouri as a surgical tech for 15 years, giving him extensive knowledge of both Western, conventional, and native medicines. He's also an ordained minister, and he's been involved with War Mineral Springs over many years. He was originally invited to do ceremony there and held many sweat lodges during his stay. The sacredness of this land is what continues to draw Jim to stay involved. I give you Jim Gooden, now Arrowhawk.
Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me? Okay. I don't talk very loud because I usually talk at the sweat lodge. Can you hear me fine? Yes. Everybody? Okay, great. It's quite an honor to be here and just to see what you all are doing to help this sacred place, this War Mineral Springs. I was invited back in 2000 to do an equinox ceremony there, and it touched my heart to see these beautiful waters and how the old people, we call them, lived there and thrived and did such wonderful things to keep their culture going. Food, the waters, I just can't say enough about the sacredness of that place. And in beginning this effort that you all are doing, I'd like to do a blessing for you. To help it on its way in a native way, in a spiritual way. What I think you all are doing is marvelous, because these treasures that we have are like diamonds. You don't throw a diamond in the trash can. You preserve it and you honor it. And so the Springs is a diamond. It's something that our Creator and Mother Earth put together for us to use to help us, to heal us. So many things. I just hate to see these things disappear one by one as so many cultures and so many good things have disappeared. Let's try to make this reappear in a good way, in a respectful way. So I'll do a little ceremony here for you. We use a sacred bic to light our fires. So I have an eagle feather here that was gifted. And, I'm not sure where the directions are. Like, where's the sun come up? Here. That way. Oh, good. Okay. So I would like to honor the east direction, to bring in the winds of enlightenment, of beginnings for this project. And then I would like to honor the south for the growth in this project, that it may grow strong, like the oak, we withstand the winds. We would like to honor the west direction for the maturity that's going to come from these decisions. I'd like to thank the north for the wisdom that's going to come for this gathering, for this project. Aho. Okay. Okay. Oh, microphone. Okay. This is, like I said, I usually speak in a sweat lodge and it's a very powerful ceremony, and it was an honor for me to bring that sweat lodge to the Springs. I'd love to see that come back again. But this place does need to be protected because it was a place of healing, a place of spiritualism. It's like when you bury the Pope or a recognized clergy, that place is sacred that they're laid into. And so the Springs as well is a sacred place where people were laid. They found evidence of humans there. And so they were laid there for a purpose, because it was an honorable place. It was a spiritual place. It was a place of peace, of enlightenment. And so in the native aspect, it should be preserved like that. So I thank you for allowing me to come here and do this for you. I've always been, like I said, been touched by the Springs and your efforts. It's just, okay, I can't say enough. Thank you, Julie.
We thank you for all of your great work, Jim. Great work. Smells good up here. Oh, yeah. No,
Oh, okay.
those are Leslie's. Leaving them safe. Thank you, Jim. Now I'd like to introduce Leslie Gamble and John Moran. Although Leslie and John will present consecutively, I am in part going to introduce them together because they're partners and because they're co-creators of the Springs Eternal Project. I always say Eternal Springs. I guess it's the way I want to think. Springs Eternal Project, which was first exhibited at University of Florida and is now touring throughout the state. The Springs Eternal Project came out of a shared passion for blue water. And when you see their presentations, you will want to know more about their dedication to inspiring Floridians to value and restore our precious water. There's a lot of information about their project on the presenters table. First, let me introduce to you and give the microphone to Dr. Leslie Gamble, who received her PhD from the University of Florida, where she now teaches art history and art water ecology as a place-based course, focusing on our Florida Springs. Again, Dr. Gamble is the co-creator of the Springs Eternal Project, and her passion, I have read, is to create a living museum that would help us to realize our living connection to the water and to each other. And we're very privileged to have her here today. Leslie?
Well, I'm so pleased to be here today, and I'd like to give everyone here a warm, healing Mineral Springs kind of welcome and thank you. And a special thank you to Julie, who's done so much to organize all of this and done so much for Warm Mineral Springs, and to all of the friends of Warm Mineral Springs, who I can feel the energy and the power of your intentions here. So thank you. I'm part of the Springs Eternal Project, as she mentioned, and together with John Moran, let me know if this is working properly, with John Moran and Rick Kilby, we have filled museum walls, we've wrapped city buses, we've given tours of the exhibition with decision makers, legislators. We've done a lot of outreach work. But what I want to talk to you about today in this limited amount of time is I want to sort of show you how somebody who was not involved with Springs, how I got involved with the Springs Eternal Project, what it was, how it was that I made the decision, or how I came to partner with John Moran to do this project. Because I think that's valuable information for people to know when you're trying to reach people who are outside the environmental movement. And I also want to draw attention to this slide. This is a photograph I took in Peacock Springs to let you know that this, in fact, is a real picture of a spring that used to run crystal clear and is now covered with columns of floor-to-ceiling algae. This used to be a rich and beautiful spring, and it looks like this now, a completely otherworldly monoculture environment. And I do want to suggest that this move from these diverse and clean and healthy environments to these toxic and monoculture environments is something that's happening not just in our waters, but in our soils, in our around the globe. So I just want to mention that. So I'm an artist. Oh, where's the clicker? There we go. So I'm an artist and an art historian, but primarily I'm a water and nature lover. So I'm constantly asking this question: how do we image and imagine nature? How do we frame something that always exceeds us, is always bigger than ourselves, our vision, our knowledge, even our capacities for understanding? And what are the effects of our efforts? You might think that you are capturing nature, but more often than not, it's capturing you, taking you somewhere you'd never imagined. So how I came to partner with John Moran and the Springs Eternal Project is a story in part about the nexus of art and collaboration and the issues of visibility. When I arrived, so my introduction to the Springs primarily was through horses and Tarzan, kind of an unlikely route. When I arrived in Florida in 1980, I had been a professional horse trainer on the A-show circuit from the age of 14. And I'd always ridden the winter circuit here in Florida, but when I moved here permanently, I ended up in the town of Ocala, training out of a stable that was owned by the Galloway family. Now, the Galloways are a very large family, and they had a very large family photo album. And Mary Galloway's grandfather just happened to be Shorty Davidson, who was one of the owners of Silver Springs. He bought the Springs in the 1920s with Carl Ray. So the Galloway family album was filled with old black and white photos of Silver Springs, and it was a pretty interesting story that included celebrities like Johnny Weissmuller and Lloyd Bridges or Tarzan and Sea Hunt, right? And I just thought, oh my God, I've arrived in this exotic aquatic Hollywood. I knew nothing about the Springs, but what really interested me was this story, how Silver Springs had become the capital of the aquatic entertainment industry in America, or at least for a while. The Springs had been a tourist attraction since the mid-19th century, but in the 20s and early 30s, business was slow. So Shorty Davidson and his partner, Carl Ray, cooked up every opportunity to garner public attention for their springs. Here we see a photograph of President Calvin Coolidge, who had just taken a ride on a glass-bottom boat. You know, not bad. When was the last time you got a president of the United States to come visit your spring, right? And then they had, as part of their marketing scheme, Davidson and Ray had the genius to hire Newt, the human fish Perry, to develop their new underwater aquatic shows at Silver Springs. Now, Newt worked the entertainment angle in lots of new ways. He had a great sense of the comedic. He loved underwater stunts. He loved visual jokes. And ever the innovator, He would go on to train generations of underwater performers, including the mermaids at Weeki Wachee, and he would also design these very amusing ways to promote them. You can imagine what it must have been like to be that woman as a mermaid traveling around to cities like Tampa and Gainesville and different places to promote the springs, or to promote Silver Springs. But the innovation didn't stop there. Perry teamed up. He was a consummate collaborator with many others, including Riku Browning, Grantland Rice, and Bruce Mozart. And together, they pioneered the underwater film and photography right here in our Florida Springs. There's an amazing history to be written there that very few people know about or talk about. But the primary marketing problem that Davidson and Ray were experiencing was how to make visible the unique but invisible qualities of Silver Springs, mainly its miraculously clear water. It's the same problem that we have today, just from a different angle. How do we tell people, how do we alert people to what's happening in our springs, the degradation they might not see, or if they do see it, they don't understand it? So it's very interesting to me that they chose a scene right here of art making to emphasize the visibility of the water through the ability to see. And we can wonder if they're using watercolors there to paint with, right? And they use another very, or even more transparent aesthetic medium, photography, to document their visibility. So what they're doing is a really curious and interesting balance between nature and art, or nature and artifice, right? And this really captured people's attention. At the height of his career, Bruce Mozart's photographs were appearing on an average of 2 magazine covers a month across America and the globe. So a lot of these visual jokes are about showing seeing as a way to make the invisible visible. Now, as we know, if you look at the picture on the left, a fish is not supposed to see the hook, right? But the joke is that we're getting hooked by a pretty mermaid. And if you look at the right, we know that the air conditioning unit shows the flow of the cold water, but the window offers an opportunity to show how looking and seeing can cross boundaries. Often gender scenarios, playing with the boundaries between apparent oppositions, whether it's girl-boy, hot-cold, water-air, inside and outside, or the real and illusion. Here, the bubbles work like the bubbles in a comic strip, right? Her words are bubbles. And then here, in fact, humor might actually help you to live longer. Because Bruce Mozart, who's now in his 90s, at least when I last checked, still goes to his studio every single day. And it's right around the corner from Silver Springs. And if you talk to him, he'll tell you that he never liked the eelgrass back then. He preferred to shoot with bare sand. So this visual picture is the activity, or this activity is both a visual gag or a joke, and it's also a kind of Mozart wish fulfillment. He wanted to cut that grass. He wanted that grass out of Silver Springs. But of course, today when I look at this image, what I see is a gag. I gasp because, as you probably know, our beautiful eelgrasses are endangered, and many of our springs, including Silver, the eelgrass has vanished or is covered in slime, the victim of algal overgrowth fueled by nitrate fertilizers, sewage, and our overpumping of the aquifer. So now the problem of visibility is even more acute. But Davidson's and Perry's and Mozart's marketing campaigns were a success, at least temporarily, because by the 1950s, Silver Springs had lured audiences as well as TV shows and films from Tarzan to Sea Hunt, as well as stars like the incomparable Esther Williams, right? Shown here during the filming of Jupiter's Darling. Silver Springs was an enormous success, at least until Disney, when the tastes of audiences shifted from the wonders of nature made visible through art and humorous artifice to the wonders of artifice as a substitution for the wonders of nature. I think that's a really important distinction. So maybe because, like many people, I was introduced to the springs through photographs, wonderful old photographs, and not the springs themselves, here's what I thought a Florida spring would be like when I actually did get there. I love this photograph. But when I finally visited an actual spring, Silver Springs, I have to admit I wasn't impressed. I couldn't see past the attraction. I wasn't attracted at all. It's completely developed by entertainment things, exotic animals, and kind of a circusy feeling place when I was there. So I actually thought, what's the big deal about springs? And then my next brush with springs was in college when the friends took me tubing on the Itchitucknee and Santa Fe rivers. And it was pretty and it was fun, but it was really crowded. And mainly what I remember was lots of cold beer and a very cold butt, but nothing about the springs themselves. And in fact, it wasn't until a friend visited, and I didn't really know what to do with him, that I went back to the Itchitucknee. But this time, I went with a rented mask and snorkel in hand. I donned the mask, I slipped into Blue Hole, and my whole world tilted. I was reeling. I couldn't tell how deep it was. I couldn't tell if something was very close or very distant. I was bereft of all my visual guides, and it was marvelous. The Blue Hole was a world of flickering light, darting fish, a sea of undulating eelgrass. Rays of coruscating light streamed into its circular maw, a vertiginous rush of gold-tip arrows passing ghost-like through the upwelling effervescence of divers suspended below. It was a world of brilliant blue and rock-hewn beauty, transparent as air. Here's where I found my aqua-sapient heart, in the blue ether of another world. Here's what a healthy spring looked like back then. Crystal clear water, a robust diversity of healthy plants and animals. And so I began taking my own pictures, pretty bad pictures, of course, but it was my way of beginning to come to understand this place that was captivating me. But it wasn't until, so I was still at the University of Florida, and I happened to walk by in the Wrights Union Hall, the student hall, and I happened to see a Margaret Ross Tolbert Springs painting there. It wasn't until then that I began to understand some of my fascination with the springs, and this really surprised me, because it wasn't until I saw a work of art, a painting of a spring, that I began to make sense of and expand my experience in a spring. Margaret's paintings allowed me to see that part of my fascination with springs is that they offer the uncanny ability to experience two seemingly contradictory experiences at the same time: surface and immersion. The surface of a spring functions like a lens. It collects, bends, and distorts lights and objects. Then a breeze blows and fractures the contiguous surface, throws fissured rainbows and pulsing patterns. You might think that a lens makes something visible or discernible, maybe a fish or a turtle or a leaf. But really, what the lens of a spring is always showing you is the lens itself. This is science, of course, but there's also an esoteric or spiritual lesson in these lenses, in these springs. So the amazing thing is that the lens is a surface, it's a prism, but in a spring, it's a prism you can enter. I think that art can offer a piece of what always escapes us. And, well, it's this kind of aesthetic relationship to nature that I believe has an ethical dimension to it. It fosters a quality of wonder paired with humility and sometimes humor, but it acknowledges that the world of nature is always bigger than us, bigger than what we can possibly know or bigger than what we can possibly take in. So I think that art offers a piece of what always escapes us, a tiny sliver of that. But it also allows nature to remain bigger and not completely knowable, so that we retain our humility and, ethically speaking, we choose to listen to nature as our guide, to act with care, to do no harm, precisely because we don't know the whole picture, story, or explanation. But art can be about knowing too. So I want to say that yes, it's not to say that we can't know some things. We certainly can. We can certainly have the science that we know that we need now to act about saving our springs. But I began to pay a lot more attention to springs and to art. The springs were and are changing, and Margaret noticed this because she was using different pigments suddenly. Her hues were shifting from a predominance of blues to greens. Other lovers started noticing the changes too, but most of us at the time didn't really know what was causing them. We do now, however, as I mentioned earlier. So the other thing I want to mention is that most people don't think of art as research, but it is. Artists are continually asking questions, posing hypotheses, conducting experiments, failing and rethinking a lot, just like scientists. And they succeed a lot too. Tolbert's outcome was a book called Aquafarius, which is a beautiful book that blends art and science. Margaret had 13 of our foremost Springs researchers and scientists contribute essays. Dr. Knight has an essay in this book, and it's interspersed with Margaret's paintings and poetry and photographs and descriptions of 12 springs. It's a gorgeous collection that combines aesthetics, education, and advocacy. And of course, Margaret's done a lot more work. I encourage you to go to her website. She has lots of other projects that she's worked with. This is another example of Johnny Dane painting, but I don't really have time to talk about it, but I just want you to know that there's lots of ways that art can contribute to our knowledge about the springs. Here Johnny's painted the 0.05, which is the parts per million of nitrate that a healthy spring can tolerate. And right now we know that there are many healthy springs that are over 10 parts per million, some over 12 parts per million. And this is our drinking water that we're talking about. And this was what really did it for me. This image by John Moran is what really brought me up short. It's two images of the same site on the Ichetucknee River 11 years apart. I could see the changes. They were undeniable. It broke my heart. It pissed me off. It inspired and motivated me. I had to ask myself, what can I do? So I began at that time to volunteer for Florida's Eden for a while, and I started to learn about springs issues and activism. I returned to taking pictures again as a way to begin to make sense of what was happening, my own feelings about the springs, and as a spur to research. This is a picture I took a year ago. This is a picture of a debacle. And this is, again, that floor-to-ceiling algae in Peacock Springs in Lorville. So when I'm in a springs, how do I navigate these contradictory feelings of ecstasy and imperilment, grief and fascination, visible degradation and luminous beauty? So I began to develop my own body of photographic work and video. Another outcome was that I began to teach a course in my own discipline, art history, on art, water, and ecology. And I don't want to talk about this long, but two things about this. I managed to figure out my discipline of art history, and I managed to figure out a way to look at it through the lens of a spring. So I thought, okay, I'm going to look at the history of eco-art, which there's a long history of eco-art, and social practice art, and I decided to teach that history through the lens of our local springs. I took our local springs as a case study for research and art making, and so that's what I gave my students, was an opportunity to function as an eco-artist and to actually explore the springs as well as understand the history of ecological art. So what my larger point about this is, no matter what you do or what your skills are, that you can actually figure out how to look through the lens of a spring. And the second point I want to make about this before I close is that this is an image of a collaborative project that I did with Tracy Wyman, who runs a wonderful project called Aqua Project. I encourage you to look her up as well. And we came together. I was supposed to just document this project, but we came together at the town of White Springs. Tracy partnered with Helen Miller and her wonderful Hope program for kids, after-school program for kids. And Tracy decided to teach them about our springs and aquifer and to ask the question, why or how did White Springs stop flowing? I don't have time to talk about our collaborative project here today, but I want to tell you that the value of hands-on embodied learning is irreplaceable. And the hands-on immersive learning, we took these kids to a spring and it was unbelievable. And the outcome was that they decided to paint the first our first satellite bus on the urban aquifer, a project that I do wrapping RTS buses in town, and they painted their own rural aquifer bus. So if we had more time, or if you're interested later, I'm happy to talk to you about this project during the break, but I just wanted to mention that. So now I'd like to pass you over to John Moran, who can tell you more about his wonderful springs images. This is an image from the Springs Eternal exhibition at the Florida Museum of Natural History, which is now up happily in Tallahassee during the legislative session. So thank you, and I give you John Moran.
11 years ago, after a 23-year career as a photographer, writer, and editor for the Gainesville Sun, he left the world of daily journalism to concentrate on photographing the best of vanishing natural Florida. He'd really like to get back to being a nature photographer who just shoots pretty pictures, but reality keeps getting in the way. Florida Springs have captured the attention of some very great artists and naturalists. Before You Now is one of them. I give you John Moran.
We may come from a variety of backgrounds, but I believe the tie that binds every person in this room is the gift of calling Florida home. I believe that place matters, and our bond with our place on the planet is among the most deeply felt needs of the human soul. And I am honored to share this message with you. I would like to thank Julie and the Friends for putting on the conference today. The core of my job as a nature photographer is to be amazed and to bring back evidence that ours is a state yet rich in the abundant gifts of nature. Photography reminds us why we fell in love with Florida in the first place, and pictures have a way of reaching people in ways that words alone cannot. I am guided by the belief that the soul of Florida can yet be found by those with wonder in their hearts. The writer Wallace Stegner said that if you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are. And so I've made it my life's work, basically, to know exactly where I am in the wild heart of Florida. And so it is my job to photograph the alligators and the beaches and the birds and the rivers and lakes and trees and turtles and flowers that make Florida the remarkable place that we call home. Water, of course, is the defining element here in Florida, and indeed, it is our spiritual lifeblood. I often wonder what Florida must have looked like to Ponce de Leon and those early strangers in paradise pushing forth into the interior of the peninsula in what surely was a remarkable odyssey of discovery. We know now that Ponce wasn't really looking for a fountain of youth, but as a child growing up in Florida, in Fort Myers, nearby, as it turns out, that myth took hold of me and never really let go. And so, like many of you, I have been on a quest of my own, seeking out these pools of enchantment that we call the Springs of Florida. When I moved from South Florida to attend the University of Florida in 1973, I knew what a freshwater spring looked like. I'd never been to a spring before, but every schoolchild in Florida grows up seeing pictures of the glass-bottom boat rides at Silver Springs or the mermaid show at Weeki Wachee. And soon I was venturing out from Gainesville to see for myself, and I found my way to Ginnie Springs and Post Springs and Gilchrist Blue Springs. And then I went spring hopping on the Swanee River, and then on to the big springs of the Ocala National Forest, where you see Leslie swimming on the surface above this column of striped bass. And folks, I am here to tell you that nothing had prepared me for the experience of standing there in real time to behold these incredible gems of the Florida landscape. And so began my personal odyssey of discovery. And as you can see, more than 30 years later, I am still searching for that elusive fountain of youth. We know that Florida is home to the largest and most impressive array of freshwater springs in the world. These bowls of liquid light, to borrow from the words of the great Florida writer Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, have lured explorers and artists and tourists and investors since the time of the Timucua. And yet, 500 years after the arrival of Ponce de Leon on his mythical search, our real magic fountains are imperiled by pollution, neglect, and the groundwater demands of a thirsty state. Some have stopped flowing, and many are choked with algae, their blue waters turning murky and green. Once a source of awe, our springs are now a source of deep concern. And like the troubled waters from the Indian River Lagoon to Apalachicola Bay and the Caloosahatchee River and Lake Okeechobee to the St. Johns River, their future is unclear. Perhaps you have a favorite place in natural Florida where you have felt the presence of the divine. For many years, Ichetucknee Springs was my place. Here I would be filled with wonder by this gift of beauty beyond measure, this endless bounty of life-giving water flowing onward to the sea. Here in the crown jewel of Florida state parks, I would be filled with gratitude that people that I would never know had the wisdom and the foresight to set aside this special place, protected forever, or so I believed. Those are great memories, but it all seems like a dream. And now when I go to the Ichetucknee, I wonder, how could we so dishonor the spirit of creation? A little more than a decade ago, I saw that even the protection of a state park couldn't keep the problems of the world away. And a thick sludge of algae, fueled by a spike in groundwater pollution from fertilizer, septic tanks, and animal waste, began to take over the lovely eelgrass and clouded the water. So what you see here is the identical view of Devil's Eye Spring at Ichetucknee Springs State Park, photographed here in 1995, and again, as Leslie pointed out, 11 years later in 2006. And then again, just a couple of years ago. I have stood on the banks of the Ichetucknee, and I have grieved for my loss. Our loss, as I consider with each passing year that my collection of old Springs photographs seems less a reflection of the real Florida than a catalog of what once was. If a foreign power had invaded Florida and done to our rivers and lakes and springs what we've managed to do all by ourselves, we would be up in arms to defend our precious waters. It's not just the springs, of course. Problems plague other Florida waters as well. Here's the Peace River and Lake Brooklyn near Keystone Heights, and the St. Joseph Peninsula in the Panhandle. Here's another picture that you won't be seeing in the state tourism brochures. I believe that Governor Reuben Askew had it right when he declared in 1971 that here in Florida, ecological destruction is nothing less than economic suicide. What Askew gave voice to was the recognition that no matter how you define the good life here in Florida, the health of our economy is inseparable from the health of our environment, and indeed a healthy environment is our greatest economic asset. We would do well to heed the words of former Interior Secretary Stuart Udall, who said, "Over the long haul of life on this planet, it is the ecologists and not the bookkeepers of business who are the ultimate accountants." Despite the remarkable rains of the past 2 summers, the trend remains that the rivers and lakes and springs of one of the wettest states in America are being depleted by groundwater overpumping. Here is the chain of lakes in the Apalachicola Forest near Tallahassee, as seen about 5 years ago. And then again a couple of years ago, just before the drought broke. 3 years ago, I accompanied a group of seniors on a tour of historic Kissingen Spring in Polk County, which now alternates between being bone dry and a stagnant puddle. In 1950, Kissingen became the first major spring in Florida to cease flowing from human causes. In this case, nearby phosphate mining operations. I invite you to look at these pictures of old Kissingen. This place added immeasurably to the life of its community, and you can be sure that it would be unthinkable to the people depicted in these photographs that their beloved spring would someday cease to flow. And here is Kissingen Spring today. 100 years ago, trainloads of tourists came daily to take the healing waters of White Sulphur Springs on the banks of the Suwannee River. Presidents Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft were among its famous visitors. Since the 1980s, the spring rarely flows. As Jim Stevenson, the former chairman of the Florida Springs Task Force, has said, when you buy a spring, all you're buying is a hole in the ground. You're not protecting the water. Hydrogeologists have shown that the springs of the Suwannee are going dry in part because of lawns being watered in Jacksonville, 70 miles away. 25 years ago, Fanning Springs was a true gem of natural Florida, a sub-aquatic paradise of surpassing beauty. Now, the native vegetation is gone, replaced by dense mats of algae fueled largely by agricultural fertilizer and manure. And now, when you go swimming in this protected state park, you are greeted by a sign that warns that you might feel ill if you get in the water. Let me ask, when you look at slime-encrusted Fanning Springs, do you see evidence of a state, quote, committed to getting the water right? Let me tell you what I see. I see a growing public health threat. I see a deepening environmental crisis. I see a looming economic disaster. And I see a public relations nightmare for a state that can ill afford to lose its reputation for natural abundance and clean water. I see a message to the future that says that the desires of today are more important than the needs of tomorrow. I see a picture of heartbreak and shame. The acclaimed 18th century naturalist William Bartram was so moved by the extreme clarity of a Florida spring that he declared it the blue ether of another world. And that description seemed apt when I first visited Pitt Spring in 1992. But when I returned 3 years ago, I found that the years have not been kind to this fading beauty on Econfina Creek near Panama City. The Northwest Florida Water Management District recently completed a $1.3 million restoration project here, but recurring outbreaks of algae now tarnish the spring. I remember what a vibrant place that Levy Blue Springs was in the summer of 1999. But when I returned with Leslie a couple of years ago, we found that the spring had stopped flowing during a drought which was compounded by massive groundwater pumping throughout the region. Suwannee River Water Management District records indicate that the spring had never previously stopped. Iconic Silver Springs was once the world's mightiest spring, a cold and quenching wonder known as the Niagara Falls of the South. Since time immemorial, we've been drawn to these waters. Silver Springs is still a place where you can find plenty of wildlife, some of it native, and some of it not. But Silver Springs now stands as a prime example of the shifting baseline of Florida's waters. And with each passing year, fewer Floridians can recall what a healthy spring looks like. So here we have it, Silver River in 1990 and again last year. But if you really want to see what the condition of Silver Springs looks like today, you do well to get not on the water, but in the water. And where a surreal scene awaits you, a diminished spring now ghastly and green. And what the sliming of our springs makes abundantly clear is that we have reached the tipping point, and old Mother Earth can no longer endure our abuse and still remain healthy. Next up is a stop at Peacock Springs. When I visited 3 years ago, the water here was dark and uninviting, and a sludge of algae covered the spring in the background. It is painful beyond words for me to see our springs in decline. This doesn't look like the spring that I first fell in love with when I visited on a very long bike ride from Gainesville in the summer of 1977. I made this picture of Peacock Springs 20 years ago. When I hear the phrase, "I want my America back," folks, let me tell you, this is what I think of. I want my Florida back. I want my springs back. I want to live in a state where it would be unthinkable that we, the people, could allow the loss of such a priceless natural legacy as we have in our beloved springs of Florida. Sulphur Springs was developed as a popular swimming hole in Tampa in the late 1800s. And here it is today. And if you look closer, you'll see why Sulphur Springs has become the poster child for what can happen in the absence of planning and protection. During times of drought, the city of Tampa pumps millions of gallons a day from this spring to a drinking water reservoir 2 miles away, where it is scrubbed for coliform bacteria and other contaminants before being piped to Tampa homes and businesses. The spring was closed to the public in 1986. Have you had enough? Yeah, me too. Trust me, folks, I have no desire to be the skunk at the Florida garden party. As Julie says, I just want to be a nature photographer who can get back to shooting pretty pictures, but reality keeps getting in the way. I finally woke up a couple of years ago and I realized that my pretty pictures weren't changing anything and that I felt an ethical obligation to show and tell the truth more fully. Our fabulous springs are in a world of hurt, and we are failing the test to preserve and protect our priceless blue water gems. Now, I know that most Floridians living south of Interstate 4 perhaps have never been to a spring, and many may wonder why they should care. Well, there are many reasons, and here's one. This is our drinking water. It all comes from the same source. Here's another. Not only is water the stuff of life, our springs and rivers and lakes and coastal waters are the very stuff of Florida's identity on the world stage. Ask anybody who runs a business and they will tell you that the reputation of their brand is an asset of incalculable value. So take a look at these logos. They represent some of the most successful brands on the planet. This famous geographical icon represents what Governor Rick Scott recently declared is the top travel destination in the world. But let me ask, what is the real engine of Florida's tourism economy? Lots of places have sunshine, but if sunshine was all we had to offer, we couldn't compete with the Sahara. We know all too well that Florida has precisely what most places at our latitudes lack, and that is a natural abundance of water to go with our famous weather. It's not just the sunshine, folks. It's the water that pulls them in. 90 million visitors last year, following in the footsteps of Ponce de Leon, drawn by the myth of our magical waters. It is the very idea of Florida as a watery wonderland that is the bedrock of our economy. Just ask the folks at Zephyr Hills Water Bottling Company who profit handsomely from selling that message in a bottle. So check out this ad for Zephyr Hills, which reads in part, "Where our water comes from is what makes it unique. It starts as rain in the beautiful state of Florida." What an advertisement this is. This ran 2 pages in Newsweek and Vanity Fair. It was a national campaign a few years ago. It just makes me want to stand up and salute the state flag of Florida. Folks, trust me, you're not going to see an ad like this dedicated to water coming from New Jersey. So the question is, what is going to happen when the emerging reality catches up with our reputation? This is a recent picture of a Florida spring that is the legally permitted source for a commercial water bottling operation. No names mentioned. Will the public lose their taste for Florida when they fully grasp the truth of what we are doing to our waters? We've seen the steady drip, drip, drip of headlines bemoaning our water woes. Here is the story of the polluted bubble that we call Lake Okeechobee, featured in the New York Times, and the unfolding disaster at the Indian River Lagoon on NBC News. In an article last year, National Geographic posits, if we don't watch out, agriculture could destroy our planet, and the article features a 2-page spread of Weeki-Wachee springs plastered with algae run amok because of lawn and farm fertilizer. Consider, What will the value of the Florida brand be if we lose our long-standing reputation for clean water? Talk about a game changer. What's going to happen when our reputation, like our formerly pristine waters, reaches the tipping point and the stench of dead and dying pelicans and manatees and dolphins is exceeded only by the stench of our dying tourism economy? Here is why you should care. Clean water is like your good reputation. When it's there, you don't even think about it. And when it's not there, it's the only thing you think about. Think about that. Consider, too, that like a marriage on shaky ground, a good reputation can fall apart slowly and then suddenly at the end. Consider that if a lie can destroy a reputation, so too can the truth. Just as water is easier to keep clean than to make clean, so too is Florida's reputation easier to protect than to earn back. And if you think clean water is expensive, consider the alternative. As Shakespeare writes in Othello, "He that filches for me my good name makes me poor indeed." Job one for an artist is to feel, and then to see, and then perhaps to see deeply. And from where I stand, this is what I see. Language structures any discussion of public policy, so let's be clear. It is simply inaccurate to say that our springs are dying. Dying is what happens when old trees fall down in the forest. That's the cycle of nature. But dying is too soft a word to describe what we are doing to our springs. The reality is that we are killing our springs. And the fact that none of us wanted this to happen doesn't excuse our responsibility for the consequences of our actions. The desecration of our springs is no accident. This is negligent homicide. As with the drunk driver who meant to cause no harm, crying oops is no defense to this crime against nature. Massive groundwater overpumping and nutrient pollution are the culprits, compounded by gross regulatory neglect. For more than 20 years, a growing chorus of scientists and journalists and artists and springs-loving Floridians of every stripe have sounded the alarm that our springs are imperiled and in danger of collapse. The message is finally getting through. A bipartisan band of concerned senators has drafted a bill this session that begins to correct the neglect that has masqueraded as legislative oversight in recent years. The bill is a fluid work in progress, but this much is clear. What ails our springs cannot be corrected by throwing a few $1,000,000 at the problem. We must stop overpumping the aquifer, and we must stop pollution at its source. But as surely as the sun comes rising in the east, the pushback is in full swing, and a wide-ranging consortium of businesses, including developers, utilities, mining interests, farmers, and fertilizer suppliers, have predictably responded with, "Not so fast." Many are the same folks who once insisted that we don't have a problem before moving on to, well, we can't afford to fix this. And now they claim that we need more studies so that sound science can point the way. This is a tired argument which echoes the tobacco industry deny and delay tactics 50 years ago in response to the Surgeon General report linking smoking to cancer. Come on, Florida. If that's the best that we can do, why don't we just be honest with ourselves and each other and admit that we're really only interested in cleaning up our springs if it's convenient and painless to do so? For that is surely the message that we have conveyed to our children and our grandchildren. And then while we're at it, why don't we just gather our children and grandchildren and admit this dirty little secret that they deserve no better to inherit a state in which our pristine springs, running clear and blue, can only be found in old pictures and fading memories. So here is a resolution we can all get behind. Our springs and rivers and lakes and coastal waters are world-class treasures, and they deserve world-class protection. The future of our springs and all of our waters depends on enlightened legislative leadership, dedicated agencies, an educated public, and effective advocates. We can no longer afford to buy the false dichotomy that would have us choose between a healthy environment a healthy economy rather, and a healthy environment. For the former will surely wither and die without the latter. I believe that there is no issue more important to the future well-being of our state, and nothing less than the soul of Florida hangs in the balance. The state of Florida, the state of water rather in Florida, is the tragedy of the commons writ large, a paradox in which 19 million rational people, each of us acting in our own enlightened self-interest, think nothing of depleting and defiling a shared limited resource, even when it's clear that doing so is injurious to all of our long-term interests. Yes, the reality is that our waters are in crisis, and that truth compelled me 2 years ago to partner with Leslie Gamble to create the Springs Eternal Project. And we don't have time to get much into all the project particulars today, but we've got our table set up. We invite you to come visit later. But central to our project is connecting people with place, for we believe that is critical to the long-term well-being of both. The Springs Eternal Project is a celebration of the springs that we were given, a meditation on the springs that we are losing, and an invitation to the people of Florida to fall in love with our springs all over again, mindful that the choices that we make today foretell the Florida of tomorrow. I believe that we tend to find in life what we're looking for, and I also acknowledge that sometimes we just need a break from the heaviness of the world. And so part of what feeds me and Leslie, and I'm sure every person in the room who is dedicated to the cause, is to get out there and to remember what it is that we're fighting to save. I've made several trips over the past few years to Wekiwa and Rock Springs. These are the jewels of Central Florida. And I admit that these springs are not what they once were, but I have chosen to concentrate here on photographing the glass half full. I have a hunch that on some level, every person that you see in these pictures understands that clean and abundant water lies at the heart of the Florida experience. Today, tomorrow, forever. The joy that you see here is real and important. And when we argue over job-killing regulations or whether we can afford to clean up our waters, know that there is value in moments like these. Connecting with nature and with each other in the real Florida is central to our quality of life, and it demands to be factored into our economic models. Here's a little gem on the Suwannee River that I photographed a couple of years ago, and the last time that I had previously visited this spring was bone dry, not a drop of water flowing out of here 4 summers ago. So I was ecstatic to see this beautiful little spring flowing once again. And I resolved to return with my lighting gear and my photo buddy David Monahan and light it up and transform the world, if only for a couple of hours. And we call the resulting photograph Oasis in the Dark. And I consider this to be my nocturnal love letter for Florida, scripted in light for a land born of water. Florida, we need to talk. And though it pains me to see what's happening to our beloved waters, I love it that the conversation that we are having statewide about water and Florida's future has finally moved to its rightful place at center stage. As the Everglades are to South Florida, our unique and irreplaceable springs define the health and identity of our region and our state. These are our blue water calling cards to the nation and to the world. I submit that as civilized people, we need to develop ways to grow our food and dispose of our waste without depleting and defiling the source of our water. For the measure of a civilization is not merely what it creates, but what it refuses to destroy. The vast Floridan aquifer, the source of our drinking water in our springs, is neither invulnerable to pollution nor is it infinite. Withdrawals are exceeding deposits in our bank of liquid assets, and saltwater intrusion is rising. The average Floridian is now using about 134 gallons of water per person per day. Our population is expected to double in the next half century, and the old ways of using water is simply no longer sustainable. Resistance to change is no longer an option. We Floridians are all part of the problem, but together we can fix this. Together, we Floridians can use less water. Together, we can be mindful of our water footprint and conscious that the choices that we make today about the food we eat and the laws that we pass, decisions about the stuff that we consume and the size of our families and the communities that we build will all profoundly impact the Florida of tomorrow. Together, we can turn off the sprinklers and quit fertilizing, and somewhere a spring will whisper, "Thank you." Half the groundwater used at homes in Florida, water that otherwise would be available for springs and natural systems, is poured on the ground for lawns and landscaping. I think it's time to get real about being Florida friendly. Citizens can support the people and the agencies that are charged with managing and protecting our waters, mindful that they are not immune to the influence of moneyed special interests that value their profits above our waters. And for Warm Mineral Springs, many may say that they love Florida, but we know that love is more than words or a feeling that we have today. Love is also action and a commitment to tomorrow. Here in Florida, we need a new way of thinking and doing for the next 500 years. We need a mindset of environmental patriotism that defines well-being in terms beyond mere dollars. We need brave political leaders and engaged citizens who are willing to question the old paradigm that sees the earth only in terms of dominion and ownership rather than stewardship. I believe it is time to ask not what Florida can do for you, but rather what you can do for Florida. You can be a voice for our waters, and I know that so many of you in the room are doing just that. They may call us the Sunshine State, but the economy of Florida was built on a foundation of clean and abundant water. Political leaders of a bygone era recognized the importance of this, and they provided the regulatory framework and the funding to protect the natural legacy that we were handed. And one of those natural treasures is the Santa Fe River north of Gainesville. And a couple of years ago, just before Memorial Day weekend, Leslie and I went paddling on the Santa Fe, and it was literally a sickening sight. A perfect storm of drought, groundwater overpumping, pollution from poop and fertilizer, and regulatory neglect left this state-designated outstanding Florida water literally gasping. And it broke my heart to make these pictures. Since then, the rains have returned, and so too has a measure of hope. But here's the thing about hope. It may be the oxygen of the soul, but poorly managed, hope feeds a complacency that, especially here in Florida, enables us to forget the lessons of the past. And so I invite you to take a look at this graphic of the hydrogeological cycle, and you tell me if this doesn't resonate with the story of water in Florida. Just as actions have consequences, so too does inaction. And what's needed now in Florida is leadership that understands that crossing our fingers and praying for rain is no substitute for sound water management. Here is my daughter Alexis swimming at Sweetwater Springs in the Ocala National Forest 6 years ago. And here is my daughter Alexis swimming at Post Springs 33 years ago. Now, I think I know how this is going to go down, but I'm going to ask for a show of hands here. How many of you can relate to how water has shaped your personal story of what it means to be a Floridian? I mean, birthdays, reunions, holidays, weekends, anniversaries. I mean, water is what defines the Florida experience. I want to close with a selection of pictures I made last summer at Gilchrist Blue Springs. And I encourage you to do not think that these pictures are evidence that we are getting the water right here in Florida. They are rather a reminder that all is not lost and there is much worth fighting to save. Take a look at these pictures and consider that these are our neighbors, our friends, and our families. These are Floridians making memories, slowing down long enough to connect with the earth and with each other, soaking up the beauty and the bounty of the gifts of a living planet. Every person and creature that you see in these pictures is in their own way an advocate for clean water in Florida. They have voted with their feet and the smiles on their faces to send a message to Tallahassee and beyond that they understand that water lies at the heart of the Florida experience. And as I think back on those old pictures of what used to be Kissingen Spring, God, how I hope that the pictures I'm making today don't someday become merely a catalog of what once was. As Lyndon Johnson said, if future generations are to remember us with gratitude rather than contempt, we must leave them a glimpse of the world as it was in the beginning, and not just after we were done with it. Water is what sustains us. Water is what connects us. Water is what defines us. We are creatures of spirit drawn to these sacred waters, body and soul. We must clean up our waters. I know it can be done. We are not just a nation of dreamers, we are a nation of doers. We must embrace change not because we are governed by law, but because we are governed by conscience. We need many tools in this struggle for the soul of Florida, including wisdom, perseverance, and wonder. Yes, wonder, which I believe is an essential survival skill. And I say to each of you, as you wend your way on the path of wisdom, let us take the time to slow down and to deeply connect with the source of our resolve, and that is the timeless wonder of Florida, the real Florida, the one and only Florida. For as Socrates said, wisdom begins in wonder. Thank you. I want to thank each of you for all that you do to make tomorrow a better day in Florida. Thank you.
Words cannot say, and I want to thank John and Leslie so much for their enlightening presentation. Let me get these notes in order. Now, one of the phrases John used was enlightened political stewardship. I'd now like to introduce someone who has grasped that model, that paradigm. Dr. Helen Miller is the mayor of White Silver Springs, Florida. She serves on the board of the Suwannee River League of Cities and was voted Municipal Official of the Year in 2012. She's also a member of the Florida League of Cities Energy and Natural Resources Legislative Policy Committee. Dr. Miller's credentials, both educationally and for work in the private sector, are way too numerous to mention here. She's a global fellow at the University of University of Austin, Texas, first advanced tech coordinator for the Texas Economic Development Commission. It just goes on and on. This lady is a worker, and her PhD is in the management of technology with specialization in organization theory and behavior in regional economics. I think it's safe to say that she knows a little bit about how economy and ecology relate to each other in Florida and the importance of the environment in this equation. So Dr. Miller has graciously consented to appear here briefly to tell us the story of the demise of White Sulphur Spring, and she will be available for your questions at the reception and to speak with you further. Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Julie. And Julie did say briefly. So I've got a few minutes this morning. And I want to say thank you to the Friends of Warm Mineral Springs. Coming together as you have is tremendous because it is in unity of spirit and effort that you can make a difference. 8 years ago, my husband and I moved to Florida from Michigan. And he's originally from Massachusetts, and I'm from landlocked place in Texas. That was 8 years ago. 4 years ago, about this time, I found myself as mayor of White Springs, which was a bit shocking to me since I had no political aspirations at all. But when your community comes to you and essentially drags you into politics, you have a responsibility to do so, I think. And what I found with less than a year as mayor, I found myself drugged to another activity, and that was a description of what's happening with water in our area. And that was the Swanee River, our springs, and the whole issue of water in north central Florida. I must tell you, I was not prepared for that. And I found that I had an awful lot of learning to do. And I thought, you think in your 60s and you're retired, okay, it's somebody else's job. But what I found is it's all of our jobs every day, every week, every month, every year to respond to our environment and take responsibility for what's important. And so I've been on that path with my husband ever since. As part of that research, I had to understand better my own community and what happened with the second magnitude spring called White Sulphur Spring. That research led to an ad from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1832. A spring has lately been discovered in Hamilton County, Florida. It is a boiling spring, the boil of which is 15 feet across. It then runs off through a channel varying from 12 to 15 feet and about 40 feet long. The water is then drawn under a rock with tremendous force. It is then 30 feet to the river where it breaks out again. That's the Swanee River. The spring is said by some to discharge from 15 to 20 hogshead in a minute. I think that's 20,000 gallons a minute. It is then said to perform some wonderful cures. A person went there that had lost the use of his arm, another of both his legs, one woman that was blind and had been blind for several years, one man with dropsy and one with the white swelling, and they were all cured and came away as sound as they ever were in their lives. Now, what more can we say about the healing power of water? What took 500 million years to produce, and here I'm talking about the Florida aquifer and the springs, can take but 10, 20, 30 years to destroy. And that's what happened as a result of overpumping, industrial usage of the waters in our area, which led to this wonderful natural resource, 20,000 gallons per minute, ceasing to flow. In fall of this year, White Sulphur Spring did begin to flow, a tiny trickle, but we could smell the sulfur and it was flowing. That said to us that the physical structure of that spring was still intact. What we believe happened was in 2013, due to the additional tremendous rainfall in the southeastern part of the United States, recharged the aquifer and led to the spring flowing. But that spring flow only lasted a couple of months. So we have some key terms here: recharge and understanding where the water comes from. Most of us don't understand. To understand, we do need what Julie called for, USGS Geological Survey, so that we better understand our water resources. Because without that, we're just an example of what you're going to find here and all the other springs in this state. I'm here to say we're the canary in the mine. We're the poster child for what went wrong. And now we can't fix it. Because to fix it, we'd have to fix the Florida aquifer. Well, I'm for that. And to achieve that, we do have to reduce the amount of overpumping. But in the culture we have here today, the culture, the paradigm that says water is infinite, There's so much water, it's like what Julie said, the article in the paper. What's the difference between 9 million and 6 million or 3 million? It's a big difference. Because once that usage, the overpumping occurs, it's very difficult to go back. Because we have too many people, too many messages, too many sources, the responsible authorities in this state and every place else saying, oh, the water is infinite and we do need the water for development. Well, I believe in development, but I believe in responsible development. To have a sustainable economy for now and the future, we have to have sustainable water. And I urge you to every day learn something new, teach something new to somebody else. And that's what I tried to do. When I found myself as mayor of a small town with no money for a budget, for planning, for research, or anything else, I did say, what can I do to make a difference? So what I did was learn as much as I could and then went to our Swanee River League of Cities and tried to inform my colleagues who are mayors and council members. And then I moved on to the Florida League of Cities, which is the 410 cities in this state. And I began to have a bit of difference with help from John Moran and Bob Knight, and Leslie Gamble, and others. It does take a village on this one, and it's going to take more than a village to convince everybody in this state to change our behavior. And as mayor, I found that I have proclamation authority. So I did ask the governor to proclaim March as Florida Aquifer Month. I didn't hear back yet. So what I did was proclaim March as Florida Aquifer Month from my position as the mayor of White Springs. And I have that proclamation at the table, so I ask you to come and join me and see what you can do in your own communities. In addition, I found that the United States Postal System can help spread the message about what we can do and what our resources are. So we started our White Springs Pictorial Postmark Program and let the post office help us. For January, we focused on cycling with the Swanee Bicycle Association. February was hiking and backpacking with the Florida Trail Association. And this month, the United States Postal System on March 29th in White Springs will have a Florida Aquifer System station, and we will be issuing a pictorial postmark commemorating the Florida Aquifer System. So 500 million years in the making, we're going to celebrate. And we're going to say it's up to us to make sure that we educate as many people as we can to change the behavior of household consumers, farmers, industrialists, and everyone. There are a lot of ways we can do that. So please come to my table so you can see a poster of the wonderful work we did with Leslie Gamble and her colleague Tracy Wyman. If you want to teach somebody, get somebody young because they're more apt to listen to you. And this project that we undertook with the Rural Aquifer Bus and teaching our kids about water was very successful. And we have a poster and material to describe that. So I only had 5 minutes. I probably have gone over already. But what I'd like to do is encourage all of you as citizens, and if you are a member of a town council or another legislative body at the local level, think what you can do with the tools available to you. And I have some examples, so please stop by so that you can feel you can be empowered to do what you can and to extend that knowledge and information to others in your community. Julie, I appreciate being here and look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Boy, it shows you what a team can do when they get together. And these folks up in Central Florida, they recognize that they've been the canary in the coal mine. You know, they know what's happening, and we've really got to bring that knowledge here to save our spring before things set in that are not easily reversed. So next, I want to introduce to you someone who's part of that team, Dr. Robert L. Knight. Dr. Knight is an environmental scientist with more than 35 years experience in Florida. He's the founder and president of the Howard T. Odom Florida Springs Institute, a private not-for-profit corporation dedicated to supporting science and education necessary for restoration and wise management of Florida's artesian springs. Dr. Knight is an adjunct professor at the University of Florida, where he teaches a graduate course on the ecology of springs. He is currently active on the restoration efforts of the Santa Fe River Springs, Kings Bay, Crystal River, Ichitucknee, Rainbow, Walkula, Glen, and Silver Springs, respectively. He is a noted authority on wetlands restoration and, in fact, wrote the textbook on this technology. Friends of Warm Mineral Springs is pleased to have become affiliated with the Florida Springs Institute and honored to have Dr. Knight here today to help us explore the future of warm mineral springs.
I'm just overwhelmed by the speakers before me. I really don't need to get up here and tell you the facts and figures. The previous speakers have been right on target. I haven't heard anything that would be a conflict with the actual science of what we know about springs, and there's no way I can put the passion in some of those talks, but I too am a fan of springs. I know very little about warm mineral springs because I've never been to it before yesterday, which is unfortunate because I teach springs ecology, and I teach about this spring because of its warm water. It's just a fascinating geological system. But I've been learning about it as much as I can, and I have worked on restoration efforts at numerous springs, and I'm interested in working more at warm mineral springs. And sometimes we call this springs CPR, conservation, protection, and restoration. So I want to go over some of the things I've learned about warm mineral springs and some of the things we can do to possibly protect it. The reason I haven't been to warm mineral springs before is that I personally live up in Alachua County up here in near Gainesville, and this is where most of the springs are. There's over 1,000 of these artesian springs known in Florida, over 1,000, the largest concentration of artesian springs in the world that we know about. Most of them, but not all, are dependent on water from the Floridan aquifer, which is probably the largest aquifer in the world in terms of total production and recharge. And then you come all the way down here. We always say, well, I-4 is the southern boundary of the springs country. Well, you come down here to Sarasota County, you've got 3 springs that are recognized by the Florida Geological Survey down here: Pinehurst, Little Salt, and Big Salt. And Big Salt is the previous name for warm mineral springs, these 2 saltwater springs. Pinehurst is more of a classic freshwater spring, and I don't even know, I think it's got a concrete slab over it now. Maybe somebody can tell me what its status is, but I don't know that it's alive anymore. Those are the ones that are listed for Sarasota County. And you can see the highest density of these springs is up north. The Northwest Florida Water Management District, where the Florida Geological Survey is located, has the highest number. That may be partly just the fact that they've looked the most. Swanee River District, these are all springs along the Swanee River, springs along the Santa Fe River, over 300 springs in the Swanee River Water Management District, 238 documented in Swift Mud, and 151 in the St. Johns River Water Management District. And there's none documented in the South Florida Water Management District, none that have any flow that we know of. But Sarasota has a few right on the edge of the district. All a spring is any place where groundwater comes to the surface. So not all springs are clear water. Some places, for example, the Santa Fe River goes underground at Olino State Park. The whole river goes underground into a sinkhole and then comes back up 3 miles away at a rise. They call it a river rise, and it looks like dark water. When dark water is going in, dark water comes out, but that is technically a spring. And when that water goes underground, the ground is honeycombed with conduits and caves, And of course, our clear artesian water mixes with that, and it turns out, even though that water is dark coming in, it's a lot clearer when it comes out, and a lot of artesian water flow is in that spring. It's a very large spring, and there are many rises like that in Florida where rivers go sink and then rise again. But any place where this groundwater comes to the surface is considered a spring, and Warm Mineral Spring is a spring the same way. So that the cave divers are the ones that know really how dark it is down in the caves. We see these beautiful images of the Florida aquifer. You know, they're all lit up and everything. You see the divers and everything. But if you go down and turn your lights off underground, it does not get any darker than that anywhere. Even in a whale's belly, it's not that dark. It's a frightening thing. And when it comes out to the sunlight, that all changes. And the atmosphere, you have the exchange of gases like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide, which is the rotten egg smell you get. And you start getting into an area of aquatic productivity where you have plants and algae living in the springs. And what has happened, the Florida aquifer itself is hundreds of millions of years old. Florida has been above and below the sea many times, and the many thousands of feet of limestone under our feet here were deposited during those times when the ocean was over this area that we're on. And the times when the Florida limestone platform was not under the ocean, it was dissolving the whole time because of rainfall, and various levels of rainfall helped create cavities in that and made the karst environment. But the biology of these systems has certainly been evolving every time Florida was out of the ocean. This freshwater accumulation of freshwater organisms, plants and animals, was developing in these freshwater environments because they're incredibly conducive to growth of life. And so there's just a tremendous diversity that's in our springs. I'm sure it's been interrupted many, many times over the hundreds of millions of years. But what we inherited a few hundred years ago in Florida was a diversity, a productivity that's just beyond measure in other natural systems. They're very comparable to coral reefs, tropical rainforests, in terms of the productivity and the diversity of the plants and animals that live in these systems. And that's one of the things we cherish. And of course, springs, as everybody has said before, are a very important part of our economy. Of course, there's plus and minuses to that. It's great for people to know about springs and to appreciate springs, but we can also love them to death. And that's something that we must consider when we think about springs restoration. So just to get specific, Warm Mineral Springs is right here in the southern part of Sarasota County, currently closed. This is on the Google Maps that it is closed, and I know you all know that. It comes a very short run into, I think it's Little Salt Creek that goes into the Mayaca River and then comes out here at Charlotte Harbor. So that is the location of the spring. Little Salt Springs, just northeast of Warm Mineral Springs. I haven't been there either. Aerial image of Warm Mineral Springs shows a circular sinkhole. This is just a classic sinkhole formation in Florida. Very dark water in the middle is the deeper water, the shallow water, and the sandy areas where sand has been accumulated and the plants have been trampled are a lighter color. And the outlet from Warm Mineral Springs is in this channel going south towards the Mayaca River. This has been drawn and mapped carefully by scuba divers of tremendous bravery to dive down to depths of over 240 feet in the lower part of the sinkhole. The sinkhole is about 300 feet in diameter at the surface. It's constricted then. It's a classic sinkhole collapse, cover collapse sinkhole where there's a debris pile in the bottom of the cavity. This was a giant cavity that the cover collapsed under some event in the past. They're not exactly sure when. It could have been as recently as 30,000 years ago that this collapsed. Sea level at that time, 30,000 years ago, was much lower. In fact, there's evidence of stalactites in this part of the cave that indicate that the cave was an air cave about 30,000 years ago at a depth of 70 feet. There was no flow coming out of Warm Mineral Springs during the Pleistocene times, as far as we know. And then the skeletal remains that I'll talk about were found up around 40 feet or so. Some of the divers that worked on that are here today. But this was an occupied dry cave, or dry sinkhole, the upper part was dry, the lower part was filled with water. It was obviously a attraction for humans and animals for many years. And we have evidence of this all throughout Florida. There's evidence, archaeological and paleontological evidence in Silver Springs of people living down in Silver Springs. And same thing with Cullah Springs. This Florida platform was like the Yucatan Peninsula in the past. When sea level was 200 to 300 feet lower than it is today, the Florida Peninsula was much, much wider, and it resembled the Sahara Desert or the Kalahari Desert. It basically was a desert plain, a grass plain with very few trees. And the flora and fauna was centered around these sinkholes, which was the only place where there was food, really, where there was plant growth and productivity. So it's not surprising that when people first came to Florida, they lived around these cenotes, which is what they were then. There were sinkholes filled with water. There were basically windows into the aquifer, but not springs for a long time. And then as sea level rose and rainfall increased, you started getting flow from these. And so this is one of the most fascinating ones. A lot of the archaeology was done by amateurs who contributed a tremendous amount of information. Skulls and skeletons from over 10,000 years ago. That's as old as anything found in North America in terms of human remains. These would be the Paleo Indians is what we call them, although we have no idea who they were. In some parts of the country, skeletons that age actually have characteristics of European people as well as Asian people. So we don't even know where these people came from right now. It's still an issue of controversy, and also how early they came. But it's clear they were in South Florida sometime before 10,000 years ago, possibly as much as 12,000 years ago. They were using very distinctive types of weapons at the time to hunt animals now that are all completely extinct. And there's evidence of this throughout Florida, not just in Warm Mineral Springs, that these people were cohabiting in a world of African-type elephants and zebras. They were basically living off of elephants and horses at the time. There was a tremendous population of horses in Florida during the Paleolithic times. Well, the world's changed. We have two major issues here that I see at Warm Mineral Springs that probably need some form of restoration. One is the fact that the flows are declining. That's a sure sign that, and it's a long-term decline. Year to year, spring flows fluctuate because they're totally dependent on rainfall. But the rainfall is just the deposit in the checking account. If we start spending more, in the past, before we started pumping groundwater, just as little as 150 years ago, we weren't pumping groundwater in the state of Florida. You could put a well in, and they did in the coastal areas, and have 40 feet of head from the groundwater. There was that much pressure in the aquifer in the 1880s when Savannah put their first wells in. By the 1960s, the level of the aquifer was 90 feet lower in Savannah. And the same thing was true in Fernandina and Jacksonville. They all were operating off of artesian wells. And I'm sure the same thing was true down here at that time because of high rainfall, a very full aquifer overflowing. But the only outlets from the aquifer were the springs. And then, of course, we started building wells. Those wells that they put in that flowed for free, they had to put pumps on in a matter of a few decades. And then we've gradually been increasing our pumping rate to where we're pumping over about 4.5 billion gallons every day from the aquifers of Florida. A very, very large quantity of water. And during dry years when we have to irrigate all the time, it's much more than that. That's just the average amount. So these are the two big issues that I see for Warm Mineral. I'm going to mostly talk about the groundwater depletion issue because our water management districts are still in denial about this. Their models are telling them that the spring flow reductions that are visible and obvious to everybody are the result of rainfall changes rather than pumping. And their models are flawed. We know that now, and those models are being reviewed and being questioned in greater and greater depth, but there's a great reluctance to not believe those models because if that's the case, then there's a lot of people that are going to be pissed off about the water use permits they have they can no longer use, and the state's afraid of being sued by those people. So these are some of the uses: agriculture, residential, golf courses. Every use takes water away from our springs. Every glass of water that you take here is from the aquifer and from springs, especially up in North Florida where we live. The Floridan aquifer is the water supply up north. Down here, it's not the principal water supply. you have a shallower aquifer that you use for your water supply. But all that excess water used to flow out at springs, and so when we use that water, we are always taking water that otherwise would be coming out of springs. We can't help but have an effect, but the only way to understand it is to actually do a water balance. So the flow data for warm mineral springs are spotty, indicating about, these are in cubic feet per second, 1 cubic foot per second is about 650,000 gallons per day. And the data indicate a decline, but you know, there's noise in the data. Like I said, there's wet years and dry years. They indicate a long-term decline. And I understand that there's even more data after this period that is not published and not available. In fact, I called Sarasota County, the Environmental Protection Group there, to ask for those data, and they said, well, we really can't share that with you if you're working with the Friends of Warm Mineral Springs, because this is in litigation. That's what I heard. And so anybody here from Sarasota County government, this is about science. This is not something that you hide data on. This is something where you share and you have to work together to solve problems. So I don't know what the flow is, but I did go there yesterday and look at it, and it's very low, the discharge. We think it's down to about 3 CFS now, based on the more recent records that the Florida Geological Survey has done. You've seen these pictures. It was about 46 million gallons a day historically at White Springs. Of course, it wasn't flowing at all in 2011. It's barely flowing now. When it does flow, that is, as Helen didn't point it out, but that's the Swanee River. If you look through those openings, that's the Swanee River down there. The whole Swanee River stopped flowing. You could step across it, right, John? John made some beautiful images of, yeah, I mean, it wasn't completely stopped, but it was, you know, water you could carry off in a wheelbarrow, really, because you could step across the Swanee River up in the northern part, or in the upper Swanee River during this time. This whole aquifer is being depleted, not just from the mining right around White Springs, but by pumping as far away as Savannah, Brunswick, Jacksonville, Daytona, Orange County, Hillsborough County. These areas are depleting the aquifer enough to stop the flow in these springs. And let's see what I put in here. The point is that the Florida aquifer in places is thousands of feet thick, fresh water, perfectly usable water, relic water, you know, fossil water, as some people call it. Maybe water a million, well, not a million, because the sea was in the aquifer. It could be 30,000 years old. But it's only the water at the top of the aquifer that affects the springs. So if we decide to go ahead and deplete the Florida aquifer, we'll probably have, you know, 50 or 100 years more to do that. But all our springs will stop flowing, and it's very likely to happen in the next 10 to 20 years at the rate we're going. They'll stop flowing. That means all the base flow to our rivers that are dependent on spring flows will stop. And the Swanee is one of those. The flow in the Swanee River has gone down over 40% in the period of record since the 30s. Over 40% of its base flow is totally gone now because it's being pumped. And the same is true in the St. Johns River, the Santa Fe River, the lower Withlacoochee River, the northern Withlacoochee River. All these systems that put out all this fresh water to the estuaries, to our coastal estuaries, and that our wildlife populations, our coastal food and shellfish populations were dependent on, are now being depleted. And yeah, we can go ahead and pump down a lot more here and just forget the springs. They will be only living in the images of John Moran and others. But, and we may get another 50 years out of that, but this state will be dead. I mean, literally it'll be dead. You'll have all the rivers will be dry. You won't have coastal productivity. You will have lost the economy of the state. And it becomes more and more difficult to pump water. All the wells, you know, most of our wells are just in deep enough into the aquifer to get water. But now we have more and more wells, just private wells, and actually municipal wells that are either going dry or going salty. This is what the inside of the aquifer looks like. The real question that you'll not find any of the water management districts dealing with, none of them, is how much water can we use and still have a strong environment. And they're supposed to do this. Since 1972, there's been a law that's required the state to establish minimum flows and minimum levels in the aquifer and in the springs. And there's a handful that have been done, and it's a very laborious process the way they're doing it. And they still have not talked about overall how much water there is. So I decided to do it myself with the Springs Institute. And so we looked at the water uses, we looked at all the spring flow data in the state, This is where the Florida aquifer is actually used. You see it doesn't come down to where we are here. Like I said, Pinehurst Spring actually is in the area. It was probably getting Florida aquifer water. We're in a different aquifer here. It's an intermediate and superficial aquifer system here, and it's not the Floridan. The Floridan is salty here, and that's why Warm Mineral Springs, it gets its water from the Floridan aquifer. There's controversy geologically, whether it's the upper Floridan, the lower Floridan, or the lower part of the upper Floridan. I've read all those things now, but it's clearly water that's coming up from between 1,500 and 3,000 feet below ground, and that's why the temperature is raised in it to 90 degrees. In North Florida, our springs are all between 70 and 72 degrees, and this spring's 90. Well, that's because it's very deep water and salty water, which is the whole lower part of the Floridan aquifer. The Floridan actually, the aquifer itself includes the whole state of Florida, but it's all salt water and not potable from this area down. It's deeper, and it's, the boulder zone is the place where South Florida dumps its wastes. A lot of the wastes go down wells into the boulder zone, which is the part of the aquifer that's feeding Warm Mineral Springs. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some of the wastewater coming from Miami-Dade and even up as far as Melbourne. There's these deep injection wells that go to the boulder zone. Some of that could be coming out of Warm Mineral Springs, although there's no indication of that in the data that I've seen yet. But over 4 billion gallons a day pumped from all these aquifers. The Floridan aquifer, it's about 2.5 billion gallons a day that's being pumped from it, which is where most of the rest of the springs are, is the Floridan aquifer. So that's how much we're pumping. How much water is going into the aquifer? Well, actually, I don't have that slide here, but it's somewhere around 10 billion gallons a day, 10 to 11 billion gallons a day is what the income to that aquifer was pre-development. And we're pumping about a fourth of it now. So you expect, and that's a long-term average, and you'd expect that the aquifer will come into equilibrium and our spring flows will decline by about 25% based on that pumping. It's actually more than that. It's more like 30%. And these are just the counties around here. I just wanted to tell you what is being pumped in your area. In Sarasota, the latest estimate is only 28 million gallons a day. You're pretty good. That's a low county. Orange County, 250 million gallons a day. Polk County, 250 million gallons a day. Jacksonville, Duval County, 155 million gallons a day. Miami, I don't even know the number. It's really high. But Charlotte and Sarasota are pretty similar. These are mostly developments. And the reason you don't have as much pumping as, say, Manatee and DeSoto is you don't have as much agriculture. And agriculture is the big thing. There's a lot smaller population, for example, in DeSoto, but a much higher pumping rate, 3 times as much pumping, both from industrial and agricultural uses. And so water, the total water use just in the counties around Sarasota is over 200 million gallons a day. And that gets to be important when you look at the water balance. So for the whole Florida aquifer system, the recharge is, we think it's about 13 billion gallons a day. This includes Georgia and South Carolina and Alabama. And the total pumping is about 2.6 billion gallons a day, or about 26% of the entire income. And this is the levels in that aquifer. You see wet and dry years, the levels go up and down, but the trend is a clear declining trend in the Florida aquifer. And that's the only reason springs flow is because the water level in the aquifer, the pressure in the aquifer is higher than the spring vent, like that bucket I showed you. And as soon as it gets lower than that vent, then the springs stop flowing, and it looks like the one at White Springs. And that's what's happening. So yeah, I do have the whole balance in here. This is the pre-development spring discharge estimated for all the springs in the state of Florida, about 11 billion gallons a day. By when we started getting detailed measurements, it was about 10.5 billion gallons a day. It fluctuated between 10 and 12 billion gallons a day all the way up until the 1980s decade. And since then, it's been dropping like a lead balloon. And the cumulative change, it was going up and down. It was actually went up during the 60s. We had a very wet period where we had more income, obviously. But that overwhelmed, and now the pumping's overwhelmed that, and we're in a drier period. And so the net decline in total spring flows in Florida, we estimate is 32%. That's the actual best estimate right now of spring flow declines in Florida, about 32%. Like I said, we're pumping about 25%. So part of that is due to rainfall declines, part of that is due to pumping. A very large part of it's due to pumping. We broke that out by water management district, the number of springs in each district, And you see South Florida is not included because they didn't have any springs and there's no recharge to the Floridan there. So here's the reductions. The Swanee River Water Management District has a decline of 48% in their springs. And this is what we're seeing. That's, I told you, the Swanee River is down over 40%. It's because the springs have stopped flowing. That's the base flow is gone. Southwest Florida, about almost 20%. St. John's about 20%. And Northwest Florida about 16%. The average overall 32%. Well, why is that important? That doesn't sound like much. You know, they still have a lot of water. That's the average. During a dry year, the income to the springs is probably half of what it is during a wet year. And so during a dry year, or several dry years in a row, the springs can stop flowing completely, even though you're only pumping half of the flow of the springs. You're depleting the aquifer at the same time there's less rainfall. So it adds insult to injury. Actually, what we've determined scientifically in terms of harm to springs is that any reduction of greater than 10% and possibly 5% is too much for a spring on average, because that equates to like a 30 or 40% change during a dry year. And that's just too much for the ecology to handle. So what's happening here? This is a map of groundwater level declines from pre-development up to 2000, produced by the Florida Geological Survey. This is a giant decline in the Hillsborough County, Polk County area, just north of you, and you're in the shadow of that, basically. These declines are more than 60 feet. The Florida aquifer surface has declined by more than 60 feet in those areas. Here in the area of Warm Mineral Springs, the decline is between 5 and 9 feet, which is enough to make the type of difference in flow that you see at Warm Mineral Springs. This indicates to me that the reason for flow declines is a decline in the Floridan as well as maybe these more superficial aquifers. But this is the Floridan levels. Could easily explain the reduction in flows. And what's happening is that we have these giant pumping centers. Like I said, this area is pumping between these two counties over 400 million gallons every day. That becomes a very deep hole in the aquifer that attracts water from other areas. And this aquifer is all a single aquifer. It's all limestone. It's got a single name. That indicates it operates as a unit. And it's like one big bucket. And this is a giant straw. There's a giant straw in the area of Orange County. There's a giant straw in northeast Florida. And like even Gainesville's cone of depression shows up here from pumping. These areas are attracting water away from the high recharge areas, which are up here in the Swanee River District and Marion County and places like that. So that we're transferring water between regions in the state by this very poor water management that's going on. We have great laws. They set up these water management districts to deal with these resources. They did not deal with the groundwater effectively because the groundwater knows no boundaries. It's not like the surface water basins that those districts were based on. The groundwater knows no boundaries. We have all sorts of evidence now that water is moving around the state between water management districts due to pumping. Whoever sucks on the straw hardest or whoever puts the most straws in the ground wins here. So if you guys want to outcompete, you got to pump more. But, you won't have your spring. So there's a trade-off there, and this is the commons that John was talking about. We're operating off a single system here. We need to manage it wisely. We've greatly exceeded the point of harm in terms of flows. The second thing is you can love a spring to death. This was a picture I found online. I assume this is real. This was an artificial photo. EcoFest. I mean, it's all about enjoying the spring. It's all about enjoying the ecology and the beauty of the spring. But we got to do it in ways that, of course, have controllable or sustainable impact on the resources. And I don't know Warm Mineral Springs. I've never done a study there. But it needs to be, this can be done, but it needs to be done with information. There should be ongoing monitoring at Warm Mineral Springs that tells us what the flows are. If they're continuing to go down, we need to know that. What are the effects of fertilizer control and things like that? As far as I know right now, we don't have a nitrogen problem in Warm Mineral Springs. It's always low in the analysis. Almost all the analyses I've seen, nitrate is low. And so it's protected, unlike some springs, because there's a confining layer over the Floridan aquifer here. But there's definitely a reduction in flow. There's sand being put in here. There's the herbicide additions. There are things going on that nobody's monitoring. And I don't know that we need another, I mean, I'd be glad for the USGS to be involved in that and understanding warm mineral springs, but we don't need to wait for that study to do something here. We don't need to wait anywhere in the state. We have enough information. The Florida, Jim Stevenson, whose name was used earlier, organized the Florida Springs Initiative in 2000. And we had working groups in North Florida on spring issues from 1992 going forward. We know what the problems are. We're just afraid to solve them because they're going to cost somebody something. And if everybody bore the cost individually, or I mean collectively, it would be trivial. What was it, a cheeseburger? Price of a cheeseburger, John? Essentially, for some of the types of costs. But the point is that these are things, it's always cheaper to solve these problems early on rather than to wait till the end. Like in the Everglades, $20 billion is the cost to date, is my understanding, of the cleanup of the Everglades because we waited so long to do something that. We had to be sued by the federal government. Florida had to be sued by the federal government to really start cleaning up the Everglades. I'm waiting for that suit to happen in North Florida because of the degradation of our springs. They're not just protected by Florida law, they're protected by federal law, the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. These water bodies are not allowed to be harmed, and so we should protect them. Is Kirk Bowen in the audience here? I don't know, I borrowed this picture off the internet. Beautiful image, could have been by John Moran. There are ways to deal with water and manage it and make it sustainable. One way that we're doing it, that you're doing in South Florida, is through wetlands like this, where you take your wastewater and recycle it to the aquifer through wetlands. That removes the nitrogen but still recharges the groundwater. This is being done more and more in North Florida now too. And we just need to use the springs sustainably. Our human uses, we need to have a carrying capacity for humans in these springs and what we can do in our springs. And springs are not swimming pools. I mean, they've been turned into swimming pools, but that's not what they were originally. So we need to, can we preserve half of the spring as a non-swimming area or more? I understand Little Salt Spring is protected from a lot of these uses, and so maybe having some springs to protect and some to love is an alternative, but we've turned a lot of our springs into swimming pools, and that's done a lot of damage. So we're lucky that sea level's coming up. That means we're going to get more rain in the future, is the history of sea level. From that standpoint, it's good. We're going to have more fresh water to deal with. But we need to lower our uses. We're already using much more than the system can supply and still have a sustainable environment. It's just we've got a limited capacity. We have to live within our limits, just like you have to live within your checking account, or you should have to. But we can protect these water bodies. Another one of John's photos that you saw. But please do what you can to protect warm mineral springs, and I hope to learn more about it in the future. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Knight, very much. Now, I don't know if I told you, Dr. Knight, that I've done some research. There are over 20 freshwater wells that have turned to salt in the last 3 years in warm mineral springs. For those of you living around the springs, where I do, so I talk to people. 20 freshwater wells turned to salt. So there's something going on with the hydrology. And gee, would have been nice if Sarasota County would share their public record statistics with someone like you, but it's the attitude. I'd like to now move ahead and introduce to you one of my new favorite people. And his name, I say new favorite people because I've only known him a little while. But his name is Ray Judah. And he's best known as a former Lee County Commissioner. Ray holds a Master of Science degree in Natural Resources and a Bachelor's in Zoology. He remains and serves as a strong advocate for providing a balance between responsible growth and wise stewardship of our precious natural resources. Ray has championed many government programs to preserve and protect our critical water resources. And because of Commissioner Judah's efforts to safeguard the environment over the years, he has received many awards and recognitions, far too numerous to mention here. He's a strong proponent of volunteer service to the community, and he's traveled here from Lee County to be with us today. 5 minutes listening to Ray Judah has helped me open my eyes to what needs to be accomplished locally and in our state, and inspired me to greater service on behalf of the land and water that we share. And Ray currently serves as the coordinator for the Florida Coastal and Ocean Coalition. Please help me welcome Ray Judah. You've got fans.
Thank you, Juliet. Good afternoon, everyone. 24 years as a county commissioner. When I first took office in 1988, I was 6 feet 6 inches tall. Juliet is a genuine soul, and I want to thank her so much for the invitation. And I also want to thank my colleagues, John and Ruth Scott. They are in the back room there. They've been the champions of the Clean Water Declaration, along with Chris Costello and so many fine staff and volunteers with the Sierra Club, and they're in the back. And for those of you who have not signed the declaration, please feel free to do so. It's basically a Clean Water Bill of Rights. I'm not going to ask you, first of all, for a response to two of probably the most important questions that I could ask you. One is, are you registered to vote? And two, will you vote this election cycle? I hope the answer is yes in both cases. If there's one thing that's working with our governor and the legislature, it's that they have created tremendous deception with regards to how we are managing our water resources. And I can give you a microcosm of that, although we're hearing about the dreadful work or the lack thereof throughout this state, whether it's Apalachicola or the Springs or the estuaries on the east and west coast of South Florida or the Everglades, but primarily with regards to Lake Okeechobee, where the state, South Florida Water Management District, have treated that lake like a reservoir for agricultural runoff rather than as a living ecosystem. And on the estuaries on the east and west coast of South Florida, we have sustained tremendous damage. You all know from the information you've read in the papers and the stories about the die-off of pelicans, dolphins, manatee, grass beds, the algae blooms, the red tide, the fish kills. And it's no secret that the chemical waste and the nutrients from the surrounding agricultural land of the lake eventually discharging into that lake and then off to the Caloosahatchee to the west coast and the St. Lucie over to the east coast Indian River Lagoon has been the culprit. But what really is frustrating for me personally is that deception I was speaking of. And all you have to understand is looking at the water budget for Lake Okeechobee, you well recognize that when the governor is out there talking about how he's throwing money at what he thinks are the solutions to the problem, and that these water resource projects are going to address either the massive releases from Lake Okeechobee or the fact that we need at sometimes minimum flows to the west coast, these projects don't even come close to addressing these problems. And I can just give you a snapshot. With Lake Okeechobee, on an average year, 1.4 million acre feet of water go to tide, either to the east or west coast. About 1 million acre feet of that go to the west coast because the Caloosahatchee has a much broader cross-sectional volume. And what you also need to understand is during these wet rainy seasons, like in 2013 and 2005, we have 2 million acre feet of water. We're talking about, 800 billion gallons of water that are wasted, precious water resources going to tide. Then when you look at the water resource projects that the governor and the legislature are referring to, you recognize that with C-43, the reservoir on the west coast, that is supposedly going to be able to address the effects and to alleviate the massive discharge of water from the lake to the west coast, that's only 170,000 acre feet, 55 billion gallons of water. And when you consider that the flow from Moorhaven Lock, from the lake down to the west and down the Caloosahatchee River, provides for 9,300 cubic feet per second, which equates to about 6 billion gallons of water a day, you can understand that C-43 reservoir, to the tune of $500 million as a capital improvement project, is only going to contain enough water for about 9 days. And here we had 4 months of incredible wet rainy season. Again, the incredible amount of volume of water. This C-43 reservoir will not only not provide for enough storage, but it also doesn't have a water quality component. The C-44 reservoir on the East Coast that you may have read about is not even going to handle water being released from Lake Okeechobee. It only provides for drainage for the agricultural lands surrounding that proposed C-44 site that's currently under construction. And then the governor has talked about funding for CEP, the Central Everglades Planning Project, which will actually help improve water flow underneath the Tamiami Trail with another 2.6 miles of bridging on the Tamiami Trail. And that's all great that water can now flow under the Tamiami Trail, but you got to get the water from the lake to the bridge, and therein lies the problem. So we have lack of storage that has to be addressed. In fact, with all these water resource projects under the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Program, which I know, I think Dr. Knight had talked about, might be about a $30 billion or $20 billion hit to the taxpayers for all these water resource projects to deal with restoring the Everglades and addressing the problems with the impact of the estuaries. We're talking about less than half of the necessary storage to deal with all that stormwater runoff from Lake Okeechobee. So that's why I'm talking about deception from the governor and the legislature. What we need is an actual solution, and that's to restore the historic flow from the lake to the Everglades. And what I have here, and you're welcome to look at it at some point in time later today, is to provide for a flowway in the Everglades agricultural area. This is not going to undermine or subvert agricultural operations, but it's going to provide for a flowway. We only need 50,000 acres to be able to provide for that flowway, so we can now provide sufficient land for storage, treatment, and flow to the south of the Everglades. If that isn't bad enough with regards to what the legislation and the governor have to pursue with regards to funding for this legislative session, one final point, and this is what's really insidious, is that we have over 50% of our waterways that are impaired to drinking, swimming, and fishing. And yet what the Department of Environmental Protection now is charged with doing is, instead of cleaning up and restoring and protecting these water resources, they are now changing the rules of the game. They are actually increasing the data sufficiency requirements to determine what is impaired. And so the parameters that we once were familiar with regards to dissolved oxygen and nutrients is now all going to be changed. The galling part about all this is that the state is not providing the resources or the personnel to provide the data collection. And so I would submit to you that it is this deception that needs to be squelched, and it's going to require that all of us get fully engaged from an environmental standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and most importantly, from a political standpoint. I appreciate your attention. These speakers have been wonderful, and I look forward to the rest of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you very much. Again, I told you 5 minutes of listening to Ray. We're going to speed this program along because we've got our reception upcoming where there is real food. Not that coffee and cookies isn't real food. I'd now like to introduce to you Captain Mike Ainge. And Mike Ainge is a merchant marine master, photojournalist, and internationally recognized lecturer, best known for the number of reader-rated columns at Rodale's Scuba Diving that he authored for 9 years. Mike is the author of 10 textbooks, over 250 published articles, and the book Diver Down, published by McGraw-Hill. Mike is also an accomplished underwater photographer with photos published in major magazines and books internationally. His underwater videography has been featured in network television shows, and as an experienced expedition diver, he holds over 100 advanced instructor trainer ratings. He is an advanced diver medic and has logged more than 6,000 safe dives. Mike has participated in scientific and media expeditions around the globe, including early NOAA expeditions, and as explosives recovery team leader for the USNS Vandenberg sinking. He is the diver whom Warm Mineral Springs who turned up a lot of this information you're going to see today about Warm Mineral Springs. And I'm proud to say he's the vice president of the Friends of Warm Mineral Springs. I have to say he's one of the most principled, capable, courageous, and interesting people I've ever had the pleasure to serve with as an ally, and I would trust him with my life, and indeed, many people have. I give you Mike Ainge.
I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about what the current status of the springs is. A lot of what we've discussed today has been about the recharge zones and those types of things. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information about that because there have been no studies done. So we're operating sort of in a vacuum. There, however, is a lot of damage that's been done to the springs. And I want to first apologize because my background as a photographer was in crime scenes. I started life as a criminal investigator. And so I don't have a lot of the pretty pictures that you've seen earlier today. Mine are going to be a little more graphic in nature. So what is Warm Mineral Springs? If you talk to folks in the community, you'll get lots of different answers to that question. There's no doubt that it's a site of great historical significance. It literally rewrote North American history in the 1970s when the first archaeological surveys were professionally done. It's a site with a bond to its visitors that you really can't describe. You go, down to the local Northport community and sit at a coffee shop and try to talk to people about it, and it's hard for them to put into words what they feel about the spring. Whether you feel it or whether you don't, it's very important and vital to a lot of the people in that local community. Okay? It's also a site that's been much neglected by its owners for decades. So what's the true status? Well, the true status is we have lots of questions. And we need lots of answers to those questions that we don't yet have. So, but every great quest begins with a bit of information. So let's talk about what we do have today. We're going to talk a little bit about what's there, what problems we can physically identify, and what needs to be done about those problems that we can see today. I had the good fortune to be requested by a group to come in and do a survey for a dive operation in Warm Mineral Springs in 2010. And we brought in a couple of teams of divers, mostly from the National Association of Cave Divers, folks that have done lots of aquifer research across the state over the years and assist with a lot of the academic information that's available on the status of Florida Springs today. So one of the first things we found when we entered the water that we were absolutely shocked to find was dozens and dozens of square meters of plastic sheeting. This stuff covers the bottom. I'll show you photographs in a little bit. And it covers very large sections of the intermediate depth shelf. We also found some of it in deeper water where it had fallen from the shelf. These sheets are huge and they're going to be difficult to remove because they're now embedded in the sand, and you have a delicate balancing act of protecting the artifacts that are there and protecting the various algae and things that grow naturally in the spring while trying to remove this stuff. The plastic also showed clear signs of leaching chemicals into the water column. You can see this where the color of the plastic changes. I'm not a chemist, but I've talked to a number of chemists about this. And when the plastic gets brittle and when the color changes, they tell me that's because chemicals are leaching out into the water. We see large sections of that happening in this plastic. These sheets are held in place by sand that's not native to the environment. In fact, it's a very coarse contractor sand. It's got a lot of heavy quartz in it, and we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. PVC pipe, other weighted debris to include 55-gallon drums that we don't know what the contents are. So if you look at some of these pictures, you can see, and I don't know how hard, from the light it's hard for me to see, but these plastic sheets cover large sections of the intermediate depth shelf in the spring. Some other pictures. You can actually see some of the coloration change in the plastic sheet that's there. That sheet's actually dark brown, but it's white toward the edges. one huge plastic sheet that covers a huge section of the shelf itself. And if you can look closely in there, you can see a 55-gallon drum. We don't know what's inside the drum. You have this contractor sand just cascades down the shelf into deeper water over time. This happens to be a section of sand that's flowing over top of one of the plastic sheets, and you can see the edge of the plastic there, identifying where that's at. So, you know, we seem to have this mentality, just dump it in the pond, no worries, right? I mean, that's, this stuff was put in the 1980s to protect artifacts. One of the problems that we're having with understanding that is, number one, I don't think that's a valid process. It's been validated any place else in the world, and I've talked to a number of archaeologists around the world, and it doesn't seem to be a process that's typically used. But the bigger concern to me is the sites where known artifacts are very small. This plastic covers huge swaths of the underwater territory in this sinkhole. Okay, so you know you would think that we've understood the folly of dumping plastic into the water since the 1950s at least. And you know we have a long legacy of historical data that shows how harmful this is to both the environment and the people around the environment. So I thought that was common sense. And then I got involved with the local project in Northport. Even the local newspaper says the plastic's not harmful. So we also seem to have a very big difference of opinion in the local community with politicians and the media about what Warm Mineral Springs is. You know, we talked a little bit today about the environmental brand of Florida, but a lot of people would prefer to portray some of our resources as only a commercial brand. But even if it's a commercial brand, you have to protect that, okay? So you see the local newspapers talking about the fact that we bring these types of issues to the surface, damaging the brand. Because if you don't know about it, it's okay. That's the concept. So we don't talk about a park or a spring or even a resource, but just a brand in the local community. And that's increasingly what we see in the media and in the political discussions that are ongoing. And this is where the Friends of Warm Mineral Springs has a fundamental disagreement with some of the things that are going on in the community. What else does a dive reveal? Well, we found this coarse construction sand that was initially dumped into the spring to cushion the walkway so that people wouldn't stub their toes on the rocks. That's what it was brought there for. And they were dumping historical records that are all anecdotal because we can't find any written records, show that 4 or more dump truck loads of sand were brought to the spring 3 or more times per year for over a decade. We undertook a project to try to estimate the amount of sand underwater, and we did some rough math. It's very difficult to get definitive measurements because we can't see the natural structures anymore. All we can see is sand. We have a 1.1 meter average depth layer of this sand covering the entire debris cone in the bottom of the spring. And the shelves are covered by depths that range between 1 and 2 meters of depth, depending on what depth you're at. So an area of about 30 meters by 15 meters contains just a huge pile of the stuff that we estimated at 78 metric tons. That was just the debris cone. You can see the sound mounding up on this lower shelf. The sandfalls are also creating a different geological issue because they're creating erosion. And this erosion is continuing to threaten the stability of the shelf itself. So a couple of things that make that important is if we lose any part of that shelf, we're going to lose a great deal of what could be vital archaeological data. And if we have a large shelf collapse on the north side, it's likely that that collapse would impact the flow of water into the springs. And what you can see here is that this is where the sand is naturally flowing. It works just like water. It flows downhill. the path of least resistance. And in fact, some of these runs were probably initially started by water when this area of the spring was dry. Now, this was shot with an 18 millimeter lens. What that means is you're looking at a really big rift here. It's in context, it's hard to see, but you can easily stick your arm back in some of these holes like this one here, 18 inches or so back into the slot. If this erosion continues in this manner, and I picked this picture specifically to show this, because what's happening is a large chunk of this rock is actually being cut out. And as this erosion continues to go back, that rock will eventually fall off the shelf. It's nearly vertical there. So people ask me when. I don't have any idea when. The answer is I don't know. But the reality is you can see what's happening. And this is one that we could fit into one frame. There's hundreds of these little spots around the spring cutting into this very fragile limestone shelf. If you drop down to the 20-meter ledge, 60 feet or so, you can see the sand mounding as it comes down. And this is just a fall of sand. It's continuous, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 and a quarter days a year. This goes on continuously. And that will and does erode the rock. You can see sand falls in various locations. Here's another one. This is a picture that you saw earlier. This is everywhere that the sand is not covered by algae is where the sand is moving. It's dynamic. It's a continuous, slow movement. Sand is cutting through the plastic sheets, and if these sheets are designed to protect the artifacts, it's not doing that job because the plastic sheets are being pushed and dislodged and moved into deeper water, and it's exposing and disrupting the existing and potential sites of archaeological significance. This is a piece of PVC plastic that you see here. This piping, plastic pipe, was used to hold a plastic sheet in place. And this sheet has been eroded completely away. It now lies about 40 meters lower than the pipe on the bottom of the sinkhole. Here's another section of the plastic that's being pushed off the shelf that's about to fall into deeper water. Here's another one of the barrels that we're told are harmless, even though nobody can actually say what's in them. On archaeological sites, they use something known as a meter stake, or when these were put in, they were probably known as yard stakes. And this is a stake that should stick up about 3 meters above the surface when it's placed properly. And this one has about 12 and a half, 14 inches left showing. So you can see how deep the sand is mounted around the stake since it was initially put in, and we estimate that was sometime in the 1980s. It's a vast sand fall here. And then you go down to the bottom, and this is what it looks like. It's all pristine white sand, nice contractor sand. So we approached this in 2010 with an effort to clean it up. And since that point in time, I've heard all kinds of reasons why it can't be done. None of them probably accurate, but I want to talk about a few of those. Okay? One of the chief things that I've heard is cleanup will be destructive to the artifacts that the plastic protects. Let me first state that when we met with the DEP, we immediately involved the State Department of Archaeology in the discussion for the cleanup. And our plan was being reviewed by both of those entities together and in concert. In October 2010, we had a big meeting in Tampa that involved all of the offices. And that's the plan that we're working on. So one of the things that's interesting to me, if it's true that the plastic was installed to protect the archaeological sites, then isn't it also true that if we destroy the plastic with this sand moving through it, aren't we also destroying those sites? So there's no doubt that this erosion of sand through the sites is destructive to the context information of the artifacts, and it's quite probably destructive to the artifacts themselves, depending on how deeply they're buried below the surface. So if the artifacts are important enough to keep unpermitted fill and garbage in place, it stands to reason to me they ought to be just as important or important enough to remove that same material. You simply can't have it both ways. And you can see here the sand eroding through the plastic sheet. And this plastic sheet happens to be over one of the known protected sites where a dig was actually ongoing when they shut it down in the early 90s. So the truth seems to be that problems impede development. We're damaging the brand by bringing this stuff up. And if you look at the plan that's in place, you can see some of this. The plan, this is, I believe, from the Economic Development Council's plan for the Activity Center 7, which is Warm Mineral Springs. And what they'd like to see there is 270 new homes, 107,000 square feet of commercial development. But fear not, they have set up a 1.4 acre zone of protected area. This was a parkland purchase. That equates to 1.7% of the parkland that was purchased. If you note the date on this map, which was part of the one of the plans for proposed development, you'll see that it's dated about 6 months after the property was purchased with parkland funding as an environmental protected land. So the truth is that commercial development is the goal and direction. We see that. It's been stated, plans have been drafted to allow it, rezoning has taken place to allow it. You can't hide from it, and you can continue to ignore it because that's what we've been doing for some time now. And we can just hope it'll get better all by itself, but I don't think that it will. For clarity, I borrowed this from John. Hope that's okay, John. This is a spring, and this is a developed brand. This is one of the proposals for our spring. So one of the other myths is Warm Mineral Springs is closed as a result of efforts to clean it up. I love this as an ex-police officer, the blame the victim technique. The truth is the USGS studies that need to be done and the other academic studies that need to be done to provide the information necessary for effective stewardship do not impact recreational use of the spring at all. But it could impede development. There is absolutely no reason that the cleanup cannot be accomplished without impacting the daily operation of the spring. And in fact, in 2010, the DEP had given the initial verbal approval to a plan to do just that very thing when the spring was sold to the city of Northport in Sarasota County. So, as far as the debris in the water goes, how do we clean it up? It's actually a fairly simple process. We remove the surface debris and other items that are not embedded in the sand or bottom, use hydraulic lifts to evacuate the sand from the shelf and the plastic, and remove the plastic sheets with careful consideration of the underlying artifacts and strata, and use hydraulic lifts to remove the sand mounting on the debris cone without digging into the underlying peat or sediments. Everybody has said this is a good idea. DEP said it was a good idea. The State Department of Archaeology said it was a good idea. Everybody says it's a good idea except for developers. So, and I'll leave you with this quote from Albert Einstein because I think it's very appropriate to our situation. And I'd like to encourage everyone in the community to get informed and get active in this process so that we have some say in what goes on with our protected parkland. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, very much. And if you'd like to get involved, every Tuesday, second Tuesday of the month, here's a flyer for it right here at the Venice Ramada, 6:30 in the evening. We're going to be doing educational forums and informing people relative to ways to get involved to help educate and promote community activity that will help save the springs and keep it a parkland. Now, our last presenter, I know you must be getting hungry and tired, but this is going to be fun, is Alan Stewart. Alan Stewart's an engineer, and he served as the principal engineer and vice president of Hydromentia, Inc. of Ocala, California, From 2006 to 2011, he trained in both engineering and the biological sciences and has extensive experience in the development, design, and full-scale operation of managed aquatic plant systems. In addition, he has considerable design and construction management experience in the arena of more conventional wastewater treatment systems, including secondary and advanced wastewater treatment, sludge management, water reuse, cost estimation, economic analysis, and facility planning. Whoa, that sounds tiring. Since retirement, Alan has continued consultation with Hydromentia and others and has provided pro bono services to select nonprofit organizations. Alan maintains an interest in the role of the scientist and engineer in the development of a truly sustainable, economically sustainable society, including consideration of a new economic paradigm. He is an avid kayak fisherman and student of Native American history. Alan, it's your turn.
Working? Is it working okay? It is really cruel to put an engineer as the last speaker. So if some of you all snooze off, I'm used to it. Don't worry about it. Mike, where is this my little thing here? My name is Alan Stewart. I've enjoyed about 40 years career as an environmental engineer and a biologist in Florida. Since my retirement a few years ago, I've pursued my interest in writing and history and economics and, of course, fishing. In fact, today I want to talk about economics, but not the old-time economics, oriented simply around the flow of money, but a newer economic strategy which requires consideration be given to the dynamics of all living systems on Earth, which includes us, and the flow of the more appropriate currency of energy and materials. And this means considering the importance of sustainability to ourselves and our posterity. A very important word in our preamble. This paradigm of integrated economics, what has become known as ecological economics, will be offered as an appropriate method for evaluating options for the future of Warm Mineral Springs and the Sarasota County community, with implications for larger scale systems. I need to note also that I am a native Floridian. There we go. Thank you. And like Coacuchi, the Seminole warrior of the Second Seminole Wars, I'm emotionally and physically attached to the unique place we call Florida. This quote is from Coacuchi lamenting over his being shipped to Arkansas in 1841 as part of the Indian Removal Act. This land, Florida, I loved. My body is made of its sands. He goes on and elaborates on that, but I think it's a very appropriate quote for today's meeting. Think of the man falling off the high rise as that portion of the environment critical for human sustenance and survival. The party of the balcony represents our society at large, proof that a picture is worth 1,000 words. How's it going? So far, so good. Now I want to talk about, let's play a game of perspective. What is the world's fastest animal? Well, we all know from our childhood that it's the cheetah, capable of speeds of over 60 miles an hour. But let's not be so quick in our assessment. What is accurate is to say the cheetah achieves the highest instantaneous speed of any land animal. But is it really the fastest when we add a time element? Let's compare the cheetah and the human runner. Cheetah's saying, you think you're faster than me? Yes, as a matter of fact, you want to race? Sure, but you will eat my dust. Only for 30 seconds, then you are toast. If we look at this curve, the cheetah can run 60 miles an hour, only for about a half a mile. Then he's got to rest for a half an hour before he can run again. The human runner, on the other hand, can run 12 12-minute miles, 5 miles an hour, pretty consistently. Guys like Mr. Bacaley there that we showed can go even faster. So in 1 hour, the human runs 5 miles or 5 miles an hour, and the cheetah only does 1 mile an hour. So which one is really the fastest? The lesson here is that before we make claims about the superlative nature of one condition or another, terms and temporal targets must be identified. And I think we all, a perfect example is I use buying my Honda Insight, which is a hybrid, and I did an economic analysis, and the hybrid was $20,000 and the Civic was $18,000 or whatever. And obviously, the economic decision was buy the Civic, right? Well, I'm doing 40,000 miles a year and gas is so much. Lo and behold, I do a life cycle cost, and the Civic is much more expensive over the long term, over 5 years, than my Insight. Now, this is a pretty mundane, common practice. We all do this in our everyday lives. We do it in business, and we do it in engineering. We do a life cycle analysis, and we assign costs to all of these things. And usually, if we're doing a business, we're looking for the biggest return of investment. But when we do evaluations on community projects such as Warm Mineral Springs, it gets a little more complicated because the shareholders are diverse with some different interests in seeking distribution of dividends. For example, the Public Works Department might like the idea of a private resort company moving into the site, for they can perhaps get them to cover the capital costs of new infrastructure, such as sewer lines and water lines, which will allow procurement of more users and ultimately an expanded user base to the Public Works Department, which means more revenue, a larger empire, so forth. To a county commissioner or a county manager, such a privatization plan may be appealing because it brings in jobs during construction and lays much of the burden of advertising on the private sector. The advertising brings in more tourists, which means more service jobs. However, the local business may object because a private group will become a Walmart or a Disney, undercutting costs and offering more glitz and glamour. The people attracted to this may be less likely to wander outside the resorts to local hotels, shops, and restaurants. The spring may become Disney-fied with high consumer tourists who spend mostly within the confines of the resort. The local businesses only get a spin-off. Much of the profits associated with these tourists will leave the county to be distributed to stockholders of the resort, not within the community itself. So how do we lay the foundation for comparative economic evaluation of such options? Well, first of all, who are the stockholders? For this specific problem, I know that the entire world is probably shareholders to some extent, but the main shareholders are the citizens, we the people of Sarasota County and some of the neighboring counties. And don't forget about the posterity of the citizens. And we add this time element, which is very, very important. Future generations. Remember, the Constitution, through the preamble, obligates us. For those who have forgotten, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States of America. Time is a critical component of any economic evaluation. Critical, remember that. And when we talk about time, we talk about posterity, we're not talking a week, a month, a year, 5 years. We're talking ad infinitum, as long as we can stretch it out. What do the shareholders want? Well, we've heard one of the options, to preserve the resource in a pre-disrupted state. Is this possible? We need to understand the ecology and the hydrology. To what extent is preservation possible? Option 2, modify the resource as a component of a larger resort strategy. Option 3, allow some resort development constrained by meaningful resource protection elements. So these are basically the options you have to look at. And how long do you want to receive returns from resource management? Outside investors typically want a reasonable return on investment in as short a period as possible. That's the cheetah approach. The community may wish to maintain, to the extent possible, a steady long-term return, the human runner approach. Have you often wondered why economics and ecology have the same first three letters, ECO? Eco comes from Greek oikos, meaning home. Nomics is also Greek, meaning law or custom or management of. So economics is management of our home. Ecology is study of our home. Seems perhaps they ought to be working towards the same end, but you know, ecology is not part of an economic curriculum, and vice versa. I find this rather curious. Is it because there are two different perceptions of home involved here? Home to an economist, home to an ecologist. Again, it's all about perspective. And this is, I always find clever. How do people really perceive our modern industrial society? Well, we see ourselves in this little bubble, comfortable, air-conditioned, 2.5 children sitting around on the couch watching football games. Nice life. And when we want something, we just simply extract it. And when something starts to mess up our environment, we just get rid of it. And who is the recipient and the provider of all this? The biosphere, which is a separate entity all by itself. So we don't need to worry about that. Now, friends of mine who always criticize me for being so idealistic will say, Alan, you need to get in the real world. This is the real world. No, that's not the real world. The real world is that we are part of this biosphere. I think that's innately obvious. We just really don't quite understand what that means. But this, on the right-hand side, is reality. And reality will hit us when that guy hits the bottom of that high-rise apartment. Note that the definition of economics as a science makes no mention of money. Economics is not directly about money. It's about effectiveness and efficiency in production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. The purposeful pursuit of short-term monetary gains is called chrematistics. Anybody's ever read Paul Hawkins' book, Ecology of Commerce, he goes into depth about how we are crematistic driven. Go ahead and look it up. The cheetah approach is chrematistics approach. A true economist seeks dynamic balance of energy and materials within a defined household. And how can we not include our earth as part of our household? Oh yes, don't you just love hearing about how we must seek economic growth? Is that really what we want? And here's my vision of economic growth versus economic balance. There is a difference. It's not how much money you spend, it's how you spend it. The economic growth model, and gosh, how many times do we hear politicians screaming up and down about economic growth? Short-term, high-level profits followed by a collapse, just like our cheetah, what they call an adjustment on Wall Street. I always love it when I get an adjustment in my monthly. High rate of consumption of expendable resources, low emphasis on recycle and reuse, unmanaged population growth and sprawl, deterioration in natural resources, wide fluctuation in job availability, disproportionate distribution of money, high per capita service demands, high vulnerability to outside economic forces, and the community is left with a mess. And if you don't think this is true, look at some of the pictures you saw of the Springs today. Economic balance, reliable long-term profit margin. You don't have to make all your money in 7 years like the economists or the venture capitalists want to do. Low, steady, or falling rate of consumption of expendable resources, high degree of recycling and use of renewables, meaningful zoning strategy to minimize sprawl, protection of natural resources, stable job market, distribution of money, so forth and so on. Low vulnerability to outside forces. 3 musts for economic balance. Sustainability, just like real estate, sustainability and sustainability. What do we mean by sustainability? Sustainability means that we have a balance, a quasi-steady state between inputs and outputs. This means that the waste is at a minimum, entropy is at a minimum. The rate of change approaches 0. This gives us stability. This gives us long-term survival potential. This gives us economic predictability. This serves ourselves and our posterity. It is temporally sensitive. is in compliance with our Constitution, directive with preamble, and what I always try to emphasize, this is the real meaning of conservative. Anybody that calls themselves a conservative and rejects that model is not a conservative. Don't you think, you might think that you don't need to protect your resource. I'm going to give you a brief example. It's called Lake Apopka. I know Bob in the back there is very familiar with it. Lake Apopka is a 31,000 acre lake, just 15 miles from where Disney World is today. Humphrey Bogart used to have a house on Lake Apopka. My father, during World War II, would fly a seaplane, and he and his friend would land on the lake and fish off the pontoons and catch 10-pound bass in crystal clear water. The gourd neck at the very end of the lake there, very beginning of the lake, is a spring, in fact. And if you go there, you can actually find it. It's a funnel of crystal clear water. The rest of it is horrendously polluted. Lake Apopka has been in a constant blue-green algae bloom for about 30 some odd years. Dead fish, constantly dead gizzard shad everywhere. The DDT has caused severe problems with alligator populations. The ecology is totally distorted. And all the king's men and all the king's horses have not been able to put it back together again. We're trying, and one of these days we may find a solution. But it sure would have been a lot easier to take care of it in the first place. Can you imagine what a crystal clear 31,000 acre lake in Orange and Lake County would be worth to the economy of this area today? You think your resources aren't important to your economy? They are. They're vital to your economy. Now this gentleman, many of you may know, Dr. Milton Friedman. He's probably the most influential economist of the last half of the 20th century. Nobel Prize winner, 30 years at the University of Chicago, advisor to Ronald Reagan, a free market capitalist and anti-Keynesian economist supported by the strategy of laissez-faire and enlightened self-interest. He once said, if you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert, in 5 years there will be a shortage of sand. Probably his most famous quote is conveniently taken out of context, usually by heads of big corporations looking for justification for their avarice. And here's the part of the quote they like to pay attention to. There is only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits. But here is the rest of the quote that's often and usually admitted: as so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say it engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. Not many corporations meet that model. Dr. Friedman, when you consider the entire quote, does not seem so heartless. He was actually a very moral and decent person, and very intelligent, obviously. But he does appear naive, for moneyed interests have now written most of the rules through manipulation of politics. Also, Dr. Friedman was not an ecologist. This weakens his argument regarding economics, for he did not adequately understand the complexity of the flow of energy and materials within our biosphere, and how profoundly this dynamic can impact social society. H.T. Odom, an ecologist and economist. Crawford Prize-winning ecologist from the University of Florida, 1970 until his death in 2002. Author of Environment, Power, and Society in 1971. And if you're ever going to read another book in your life, read that one. In this book, he proposes an integrated macroscopic overview of the biosphere, including human activities and economics, suggested ecological dynamics and human economics were inextricably bound and could not in the long term be realistically viewed as separate. He helped develop the field of ecological economics, which revolves around sustainability and long-term stability. Unlike Friedman, Odom recognized certain natural processes, some critical to human society, may well be irreversible. The Humpty Dumpty effect, I like to call it. Several key quotes from Oda are particularly noteworthy, and this one, you got to listen to it and think about it, but it's very, very important. Money is a special currency evolved to allow the production of one person to be rewarded by a feedback loop from some other part of society. The money value of the energy is in proportion to the human work spent in receiving the energy and not in the energy itself. In other words, we give no credit to the Earth's dynamic processes that created the resource in the first place. When you buy a gallon of gasoline, you're not buying it per BTU. You're buying it based upon what the purveyors decide you should buy it for, based upon their effort to obtain it and process it. Very important. In man's study of himself, he has often made the systems of studying the economic consideration of currency, that is money only, thus omitting much of his system. Little wonder his understanding predictions of the economy have been faulty. This last quote reminds me of a few lines from a poem from the 18th century British poet William Wordsworth. The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away. So let's summarize it. Am I running out of time, Julie? I'll make it fast. Let's summarize a reasonable approach to the extent the community could use this for setting the future of Warm Mineral Springs. First, learn what you can about the resource. Assess the true long-term potential of the resource to the community economics. Determine how the community values the resource. Examine all proposals objectively. Consider vulnerabilities of each proposal to the vagaries of the present human economy. What will be the impact upon water supply and nearby estuaries? Ask yourself, if we accept this proposal, what will the community look like in 20 or 50 years? If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And question your elected politicians in a polite but persistent manner, the local, state, and federal government officials, and the press regarding their positions. Always be aware of the possibility of corruption. Do not be intimidated by any chest thumping or similar histrionics. And I always like to quote my hero, Beethoven, here. Love liberty, help one another when you can, and above all, the truth. Always the truth, even at the foot of a throne. There are two sayings that I've always forced myself to consider when trying to understand human behavior. First one, don't confuse me with facts, my mind's made up. You see that one a lot. The second one, a person convinced against their will remains unconvinced still. This issue is too important to surrender to such obstinacy. Take the time to think, learn, and listen before deciding. And finally, we leave the last comment to Pogo, who said it best. We have met the enemy, and he is us.